Her sister's finger came up into her face, and the whole street heard the word ungrateful. If the debut had gone the other way, she screamed, she would never have crawled to anyone. Everything she had lost, she said, she had lost because of the girl standing in front of her. So never contact me again, Mireille told her. As of tonight, you are not my family. But all of it began on an ordinary evening, months before either sister could say a word like that. Some days feel as though something has taken hold of you and simply refuses to let go again. Days that end in broken glass, a man on his knees, and a stranger watching from an upstairs window. Takahashi Mireille thought that particular night was only going to be one more of those. She was 24, living alone in a rented flat, and the day had gone wrong from its first hour. She missed her train and arrived late, apologizing to a room of people who had stopped listening. Then the rain came, and a passing truck threw a wave of filthy water across her from the road. By evening, her phone was lying on the desk with the screen cracked from one corner to the other. 100,000 yen to repair it. She counted the month's expenses, then made herself count again. She had lived alone for years without leaning on anyone, and she was not about to start tonight. Then something heavy shifted in the next room, and the entire apartment went very still around her. She pushed the bedroom door open, perfectly certain that the day could not possibly get worse. A man was standing in the middle of her room. Gold hair, blue eyes, and a cloak out of a painting. For one long second, neither of them moved, and neither of them made a single sound. He asked very politely whether she would be kind enough to tell him where this place was. She screamed loudly enough to wake every apartment on the floor and probably the one below it. Her first thought was to call the police. Her second thought was considerably worse than that. The phone still in her hand had been broken since noon and would not be dialing anyone. He raised both hands very slowly, the way people do when they are the ones who are frightened. She threw the nearest object she could reach at his head, and he did not try to stop her. Nobody had been in that room a minute ago. There was nowhere in it for a grown man to hide. She was shaking, and he could see it, and he decided that whatever else she was no threat. He gave her his full name, Leandros Julian Therion Etosina, and swore he meant her no harm at all. Lean, she repeated back at him, before she could stop her own mouth from doing it. He had been traveling to the Emperor's victory ceremony when the carriage lurched hard beneath him. He had felt himself falling a long way, and when he opened his eyes, he was standing on her floor. He asked once more, with the patience of a man used to being answered, where exactly this was. She forced herself to think it through. Nobody had come in. Nothing here could conceal a person. And certainly nobody dressed like that, in brooches and gold chain, in a rented apartment in the suburbs. A stranger had appeared out of absolutely nothing in the middle of her own bedroom. He spoke like a character out of a comic, and a suspicion started forming that she genuinely hated. "Forgive me for asking," she said carefully, "but I believe you may have the wrong century entirely." He wanted to know what year it was according to the imperial calendar, and waited for an answer. He watched her cover her whole face with both hands and let out a very long breath. It was the 21st century, she told him, and there had never been any imperial calendar here. The color went out of him. She watched a nobleman work out in real time that he was lost. "Sit down for now," she said. She thought they both needed a moment to gather their thoughts. Had a man genuinely fallen into her apartment out of an entirely different world? He could not believe it either, which was at least one thing the two of them had in common. She opened her laptop and started searching for the name of the house he claimed to belong to. He remarked that she seemed very calm and asked whether this sort of thing happened here often. Of course it did not, she said. She had almost fainted from shock 20 minutes ago. She simply accepted things faster than most people. Sitting around stunned had never changed anything. He straightened up and offered his hand to her the way men did in a world she had never seen. "Second son of the Etosina Duchy," he said, "and its rightful heir," as though that settled everything. "Heir to a duchy," she repeated. "One of those grand northern duke types, then." He tilted his head at her, entirely lost, with 2 question marks practically floating over him. She decided against explaining any of it, and typed the family name into the search bar instead. No information found for Duke Etosina. It was exactly the result she had been expecting. "Give me something else," she said. "Anything at all. A person's name, a place, a border." He leaned toward the glowing screen instead, completely distracted, and asked what it was. He was looking at a second-hand laptop the way most people look at a firework going up. It was called a laptop, she said, and it did not matter right now, and could he please concentrate? He was from the Levantine Empire, he told her, as though the name would obviously mean something. A very fertile country, he added, with one whole side of it facing the open sea. She typed the name into the search bar and sat watching the results finish loading. Nothing at all. Anyone important enough to be remembered would have left some trace behind. They sat side by side in front of a screen that had no answer for either one of them. With results like these, she said slowly, you really may have come out of another world. His eyes were an unusual color, and she caught herself looking at them a moment too long. What on earth was she thinking about, at a time and in a situation like this one? He observed with no particular embarrassment that she was staring at him rather intently. Takahashi Mirai, she said. It meant beautiful mountain, and a great many people shared the surname. Tens of thousands of them, probably. He looked genuinely shaken by the size of the number. There had been nobles here once, she explained, but there were none now, and no class system either. He laughed at that, and she discovered somewhere in the middle of it that she was laughing too. I see, he said in the exact voice of a man who had understood nothing whatsoever. The little clock on the shelf beside them read 12:30 at night. The relief had finally arrived, and behind it came the exhaustion of an extremely long day. She had classes in the morning, she said, so she was going to sleep first, and she was sorry. She stretched, and he watched her from the chair like a guest who was afraid to move. School, he repeated carefully, turning the word over. Something along the lines of an academy. They stood together in the narrow hallway of a very small apartment, and neither of them moved. Then he asked his question, and she went completely and utterly still where she stood. There seemed, he pointed out reasonably, to be only one bed in the entire place. She did not answer that at all. She went and found him a spare blanket instead. Morning came up over the campus buildings, bright and warm and completely, insultingly ordinary. She had not slept. She had drifted off somewhere near dawn and woken almost immediately afterward. She felt guilty about the floor, and glad, in a way she could not explain, that he had rested. There was still so much he needed to learn. She had managed to show him the bare minimum. He could feed himself at least. Perhaps she would buy him some clothes on the way home. The sky over the city was turning violet and gold by the time she reached her street. She called out that she was home, with a heavy shopping bag hanging from each hand. The room was completely empty. She said his name once and then again, louder. Had he already gone back to his own world, without leaving her so much as a single word? You are late, said a voice directly behind her, and every hair on her arms went up. He had been waiting for her, he said, and he used her name as though he had always had it. 2 nights later, they were still sitting on the floor together in front of a glowing screen. He watched a film the way other men watch a fire burning, without blinking once. Exactly like a child, she thought, and had the sense to keep that particular thought to herself. His borrowed clothes pulled tight across the shoulders, and she wondered whether he minded much. So this was a moving picture, he said. This world truly was an astonishing sort of place. It was like a play, he decided, except that the entire play lived inside the screen. It was the world of magic he had read about in books as a boy, and here it simply existed. Overflowing with impossible things, he said, without a single trace of irony anywhere in it. She cleared her throat, because there was something she had been meaning to ask him. How old was he exactly? He did not look particularly far off from her own age. He had turned 19 recently, he said. Born in March, when the flowers open in his country. She stared at him for slightly longer than was polite, and he did not notice at all. Which meant, she said carefully, that he would be turning 20 later this year. He nodded, rather pleased with himself, and said he would finally be a proper adult. He looked up and asked why exactly she was smiling at him like that. She had waited most of her adult life to deliver a line this satisfying to anybody. She was 4 years older than him, she said. She had never once imagined he was the younger one. Older than him. He looked genuinely appalled and declared he had been unforgivably rude until now. From this moment, he announced, he would address her with proper respect. Big sister. That face saying that particular word was deeply unfair, and she was certain he knew it. Roses and carnations, and a silence that had turned warm without asking anybody's permission. There was something, he said, that he had been wanting to ask her for a few days now. A family photograph hung on the wall behind them, and she made a point of not looking at it. Was there a particular reason, he asked, that she lived here entirely on her own? Why? Were women living alone unusual in the place he had come from? At 24, he said, most were married and a good number already had children of their own. She admitted after a pause she had not planned on taking that she had been engaged once. He asked why it had ended, with the directness of somebody who had never learned not to. They could not become that kind of couple, she said. There was nothing more to it than that. He wanted to marry a woman he loved, he said, and she told him he was more of a romantic than he looked. That, she pointed out, had absolutely nothing to do with how old a person happened to be. She had been busy simply getting by for years. There had never been any room in it for love. Her university was far from her parents' house, she began, and there was also... She stopped in the middle of the sentence and the room went quiet around her. The cracked phone was buzzing against the tabletop, showing a number she knew by heart. She answered it without letting a single thing show on her face and listened. Whatever she heard on the other end emptied every trace of color out of her. She went out into the night in the clothes she happened to be standing in. Her sister was waiting for her under the streetlight directly below the building. Whatever happened, she told him, he was not to come outside no matter what he heard. He followed her as far as the door, and she shut it firmly in his face. He called her name once through the wood, but the lock had already turned. The sky above the street was the exact color of a bruise 2 days old. Smoke curled upward under the lamp, and neither woman spoke for a moment. What do you want? Mireille said in the flattest voice she had. Her sister looked back at her with a stare that had nothing behind it whatsoever. Setting aside how she had got the number, Mireille asked how she had learned where she lived. Don't say something so cold to me, her sister said, and smiled with her mouth only. She had come all this way, she insisted, because she had wanted to see her little sister. She smelled of alcohol from 2 full steps away, and it was not even 10 o'clock. She had gone through treatment, Mireille said, and she was standing here drinking again. Don't look at me like that, her sister said, and something underneath it started shifting. She smiled again, and the smile did not reach anything at all in her face. There was no need to glare, she said. Really, there was no need for any of that. More importantly, how much did she have on her? Could she lend 500,000 yen? 300 would be fine. It would be the very last time. She swore it. What was it this time, Mireille asked. A man, or surgery, or gambling again? Start living properly already, she said, and heard her own voice go hard. How long exactly was her sister planning to keep going on like this? Her sister's hand came up fast, and Mireille did not step back from it. Shut your mouth, her sister said, and the whole street seemed to hear it. Blaming other people, Mireille said, all these years, and nothing about her had changed at all. If she ever turned up out of nowhere again the way she had tonight... What did you just say to me? Her sister said, and her eyes went very wide. A door slammed somewhere above them, and a light came on in a neighbor's window. She climbed the stairs back up alone, and she did not look behind her even once. He was waiting for her in the hallway. So you saw all of that, she said. He had heard raised voices from inside, he said, and he had been worried about her. She asked whether he remembered wanting to know why she lived by herself. That was the second reason, she said. She had run down those alley steps before tonight. Something dark had fallen on the pavement in that alley, and she had learned not to name it. It was nothing new, she told him. It had stopped bothering her a very long time ago. Lying, he said quietly, is not a good thing to do, and she found she could not answer. She smiled at him with her eyes closed, which had always worked on everybody else. He came and sat down beside her on the floor without asking whether he could. She was holding back tears, he said, at a moment when she very obviously wanted to cry. It is not like that, she said, and did not sound convincing even to herself. He went on watching her anyway, patiently, the way you wait out weather. Her mother had died on the day she turned 8 years old, she said at last. She had never once said that particular sentence out loud to another living person. His father had forbidden him to cry at his own mother's funeral, he told her. No sobs are to be heard in the ducal house. Those had been the precise words used. A small boy had stood out in the rain with a blue stone pinned at his collar. Never reveal what you truly feel. That was the rule he had grown up inside of. Something had been lodged in his chest ever since, he said, and it had never once come loose. Besides, he pointed out, he had come from another world. There was no safer place for a secret. If he went back, the secrets and the only man holding them would disappear at the same moment. His hand closed gently at the back of her head, and she stopped fighting it. and she cried the way she had not been permitted to cry at 8 years old. Perhaps it was only the warmth of it, after so many years of going without any. Her fist tightened hard in the cloth of his shirt, and she did not let go. Then a thought crossed her mind that frightened her considerably more than her sister had. She wanted him to stay in this world forever, and she wanted it with everything she had. She hoped, with a desperation that surprised her, that none of this was going to turn out to be a dream. It was the last night she would ever be certain of anything at all. He held her until the crying stopped, and neither of them ever mentioned it afterward. They fell asleep like that, on top of the covers, with the lamp still burning beside them. A few days passed after that, and something in the apartment quietly changed shape. They walked the shoreline together in the late gold of a weekday afternoon. She had not taken a single day off from work in almost 3 years. They bought a new phone, and he applauded the shop assistant for her trouble. Leandro settled into life here considerably faster than she had ever expected him to. She waited in a clothing shop while a 19th century duke tried on an entire century. He turned in front of the mirror and asked her what she honestly thought. Did it suit him? As though he had been born and raised in this world all along. Night came down over the water and the tide came in behind them. They walked the beach in the dark with the waves running up almost to their feet. He stood a while looking out at a sea he did not recognize at all. He had wanted to take her somewhere special, she said, but she was not the type who went out. So this stretch of gray shoreline was honestly the only kind of place she knew. He liked it. It was different from the sea in his world, he said. This one was blue and calm. The waves broke steadily against the seawall a little below where they were standing. This was where she came, she told him, whenever her heart would not settle down. When she looked at that horizon, it felt as though something inside her got rinsed clean. He thanked her for the other night. Because of her, he said, he had not needed to come here. It was not that big a deal, she said, and cleared her throat and looked at the water. He looked up at a sky that had no answers in it for anybody. Actually, he said, there was something else. He had a twin brother back home. He had told her he was the second son. She had never once thought about what that implied. They were identical, he said. From any distance at all, nobody could tell them apart. And his brother, he added, could not really be said to be living a proper life either. Everybody who knew him called him a good-for-nothing and had done so for years. He had endless trouble with women at the academy, casual affairs, every single one of them. So the two of them fought a great deal, more or less constantly, for most of their lives. She made a small sound and did not know what she was supposed to do with any of it. It was harder to picture, she said, when she imagined a man like that wearing his face. The reason his brother craved a woman's love so badly, he said, was not complicated. Their mother had given far more of her affection to his brother than she ever gave to him. I see, she said, and could not think of one useful thing to add to it. He was quiet for a while after that, and she let him have the silence. Then she asked whether he could look this way for just a second. He tilted his head at her, completely baffled, and did exactly as he was told. What had she done to him? It was called a photograph. He insisted he was trapped inside it. It was easiest to understand, she said, if he thought of it as a picture of a moment. A way of keeping something forever. She wanted to remember this, she said, after he left. She held the phone out toward him in the dark so that he could look properly. If he returned to his own world, he said, he wanted a photograph of her as well. He would have forgotten her the moment he went back anyway, she told him. What was she saying? He would never forget her, he said, never, big sister. Then the first drop of water landed on the back of her hand. Rain, she said. The forecast that morning had said nothing whatsoever about rain. Something at the edge of the darkness had begun very faintly to glow. She looked up into a downpour that had arrived out of a clear evening sky. They needed to get somewhere dry, she started to say, and turned around. The phone was lying face down on the wet sand, and she was standing there alone. She turned in a full circle, and the rain went on falling on an empty beach. She said his name once, out loud, to a stretch of shoreline with nobody on it. A week later, the city was going about its business exactly as it always had. 7 days had passed since the night he disappeared off that beach. The world had kept turning as though nothing whatsoever had ever happened. She went back to the library because she had nowhere else to put her hands. As though he had never existed anywhere at all, at any point to begin with. Then something on one of the lower shelves caught her eye and stopped her. The Sea and the Lark Song. It was a strange sort of title for a novel. She pulled it out of the row and turned it open to the first page. and every muscle in her body went completely rigid where she stood. The corridor around her seemed to tip slowly over onto its side. "My name is," said a line of print, and she wondered if she had finally lost her mind. The names inside that book were names she had heard spoken in her own kitchen. Leandros. It was printed there in black type on a page of a novel. Leandros Julian Therion Etosina, second son of the Etosina Duchy, and its rightful heir. She did not believe it. Her hands would not hold the pages still enough to read them. Had he genuinely come out of the inside of a book that anybody could buy? She walked the whole way home through a thin, cold, persistent rain. The lights of the hillside houses came on one at a time above the stairs. She sat down on the steps and read until there was no daylight left at all. 1,000 pages of romance holding every single name he had ever spoken aloud to her. A story in which every last piece fitted together as neatly as a puzzle. The male lead was Leandros, destined to end with Liliantius Eden, a merchant house's daughter. The book shut in her hands like something quietly detonating against her chest. She had known perfectly well that he came from some other world than this one. She had never imagined for a second that the world in question was made of nothing but words. Standing under a streetlight, she seriously considered simply calling all of it a dream. Her hand closed on itself hard enough to leave marks in her own palm. She pulled at the thin chain around her neck until the skin under it went red. She had to stop thinking about it. She was only going to make herself suffer for nothing. Even if she woke up out of the dream, the place where she actually had to live, she climbed the last of the steps toward the lights of her own quiet street. Was here, and it always had been, and it was not going to change. And then, halfway along the pavement, she stopped walking altogether. Someone was standing at the very top of the stairs above her front door. "Sis," she said, and the word came out of her much smaller than she wanted. Her sister looked down at her from the landing without moving an inch. She did not smell of alcohol tonight, and that was the part that genuinely frightened her. She had told her she would call the police if she ever came here again. "You think I am pathetic," her sister said. "You think I would be better off dead." "What are you even?" Mireille started and never finished the question. Hands closed hard on her arms before she understood what was actually happening. "Those eyes," her sister said. "Those eyes that look down on me as if you know everything." "They make me furious," she screamed. "It is not as though I wanted to end up this way." And then there was nothing at all underneath her feet, and the world went sideways. "You don't understand anything," said a voice above her, and kept getting further away. A long fall and a streetlight turning slowly over and over in the air above her. Birdsong, a wooden ceiling she had never seen before. Where exactly was she? Her bare foot found a polished floorboard. Some kind of hospital, perhaps. It felt strangely foreign for a hospital, and there was no smell of disinfectant anywhere. She was standing in the middle of a room papered from floor to ceiling with roses. Then she caught the mirror out of the corner of her eye, and something in it was wrong. She ran down a corridor with a vaulted ceiling and a chandelier hanging over it, and went down hard on the polished floor with her hair across her face. What was going on? She said out loud. Why was her face not her face anymore? Footsteps came toward her along the corridor, entirely unhurried. "Ouch," she said, from somewhere down around the level of a stranger's boots. "Forgive me," said a voice above her. "I did not see that you were there." She looked up, and the name came out of her before she could think about it. The man standing over her was 10 years older than the boy who vanished from that beach. And he did not know who she was, and there was nothing at all in his eyes. What on earth had happened to her? She said it to a mirror in an empty room. Brown hair instead of black, and not one single strand of it belonged to her. She stood in front of the glass and could not recognize one feature of her own face. Then something reached directly into her head and pulled hard without warning. It came in like a spike being driven very slowly in behind both her eyes. Memories that belonged to somebody else entirely opened up in front of her. Hazel Reeve, 22 years old, an only daughter, born and raised in Levitine. Whose memories were these, and why were they arriving inside her own head? Hazel had sorted letters for 3 years, one identical gray day after another, until a letter of recommendation fell into her hands and she decided to change her whole life. The position she took with it was a maid's post inside House Edosina itself. Mireille sat on the floor of a stranger's bedroom, wearing a complete stranger's hands. "No," she said out loud to the empty room. "No, absolutely not. This cannot be happening." Had there ever been a character called Hazel Reeve? A background name, buried somewhere. which meant she realized that the man out in the corridor really had been Leandros. There was absolutely no mistaking that face, no matter how cold it had gone. She had assumed he only looked similar. Had he always been that cold underneath? I turned 19 recently, he had told her, a week ago and an entire lifetime ago. In the original novel, Leandros was 30, which meant 10 years had passed since they parted. One single week had gone by for her, from a rainy beach to a stranger's bedroom. 10 entire years had gone by for him, and he had spent every one of them here. The corridors of the manor went on in the cold blue light of morning. Finished at last, she thought, and told herself she should hurry up and rest. She had overslept again. Finish the study today, the housekeeper said, or be thrown out. So this was where Leandros lived. Reading the description of it had not been the same thing. It was the end of March, and her breath still turned white in the corridors after sunset. She caught her own reflection in a dark window and flinched away from it. When exactly was she going to get used to looking out through somebody else's face? She pressed both hands flat to the cold glass and looked out across the courtyard. The one window still lit on the far side of it was Leandros' bedroom. He could not sleep. According to the novel, he had not slept properly in years. Knighted at 14, sent to war at 16, and then sent out to war again at 18. At 26, he rode to his final battlefield, and the enemy general sent him a gift. His own commanding officer's head, delivered in a box with the arrow still in it. After that came the trauma and the insomnia, and neither of them ever left him again. If she could, she would go and sit down beside him. She could not, and she knew it. Then she saw a man out in the corridor with a woman held tightly in his arms. He glanced up over the woman's shoulder and looked directly at her. Leandros, she said, before her brain caught up with what she was seeing. A pair of polished boots came to a stop directly in front of her. Leandros should be in his own room across the courtyard, which could only mean this man was Silas Alfonso Therion Edocina, society's most celebrated good-for-nothing, and Leandros' twin brother. He asked her again exactly who she was. She apologized as smoothly as somebody wearing the wrong face could manage. Plenty of people had seen the two of them together, he said. It hardly mattered anymore. He simply disliked having his time alone with a woman interrupted by the staff. Get lost, he said, without any particular heat, and she was very glad to. She fled the whole length of the corridor with both hands clamped over her face. From a distance, nobody could tell them apart. He had been entirely right about that. Her head throbbed all the way back to a servant's room she did not recognize. It had genuinely looked for 1 second as though Leandros were kissing another woman. It had not been him. That did not stop her hands from shaking under the blanket. In the morning, Leandros stood in his study fastening a cuff at the wrist. She watched him from the doorway with a tray she had entirely forgotten she was holding. A maid who had served here for years had gone home to her province without warning, which meant that Hazel Reeve now attended the Duke of the House himself. Why, of every single person in this enormous building, did it have to be her? She kept her eyes down on the carpet and her mouth very firmly shut. He seemed taller than before. His shoulders had gone considerably broader. 10 years had taken him apart and rebuilt him from the ground upward. He was a completely different man from the boy of 20 who slept on her apartment floor. My head hurts, said somebody leaning in the doorway behind her. Silas came into the study, still fastening the front of his shirt. He had been told not to bring women into this manor. Had he forgotten that already? Silas said. She was the maid who had been watching them in the corridor last night. He had told him this many times, Leandros said, and crossed the floor toward his brother. His paintings did not have any value anymore, and had not for a considerable time. Find work fit for trash, he said, or marry some woman and leave this house at once. He had not needed to go quite that far. She kept her eyes fixed on the carpet. Only when those above set an example, Silas said pleasantly, will those below follow. Get out, Leandros said, and the temperature of the room dropped several degrees. Wasting further words on trash was a waste of his time. Trash, Silas repeated. Something bright and violent went across the room from one brother to the other. A man who feels nothing with a woman standing in front of him, Silas said, cannot call him that. Something struck the doorframe about a foot to the side of her head. And then the corridor outside was extremely unpleasantly quiet. She started to say something, and Leandros told her to get out as well. Get lost, he said again, and did not turn around to watch her go. Yes, Your Grace, she said. Was he genuinely taking all of this out on a maid? She hid in the library, where nobody would ever come looking for a servant. He had told her to get lost. She turned the phrase over and could not put it down. She knew why the brothers hated each other. It did not make watching it any easier. While Leandros was at war, and after the old duke died, Silas drank the family name away. The territory itself had fallen into serious financial trouble behind him. But the novel was told from Lillian's side, and it had never gone into any of this at all. Then she realized she was not alone in the aisle between the shelves. A man in white was standing there reading with his back turned toward her. She felt fairly certain he had appeared somewhere in the original story. He touched the back of her hand, and something snapped between their fingers like static. "What was that?" she said, jumping backward. The thing had actually shocked her. This was rather shocking indeed, he agreed. A romance novel, was it? Was this place truly a world that existed inside a book? He asked her. And then he said her real name out loud, in a house where nobody could possibly know it. "You are," she started, and got no further than that. Silver hair and gray eyes that showed absolutely nothing at all of what was behind them. "Gideon," she said, before she had the sense to stop her own mouth. Since she already knew his name, he said, smiling down at her. Then she also knew he was advisor to House Etosina, and that he was a prophet. It was a detail that existed only in the original novel. There was no way she would miss it. Long ago, during a war that dragged on for several decades without ending, 12 people gave themselves to the ocean currents and sailed toward whatever fate offered. A storm swallowed them whole in open water, and they vanished without leaving any trace. 200 years afterward, all 12 of them walked back ashore again, with faces that had not aged by a single day, and abilities nobody could account for. People called them prophets. Gideon could read a mind through the touch of bare skin. A single strand of hair was enough, he told her, though it did not work through cloth. A foreigner who knew the future, standing in a ducal library holding a dustcloth. She did not intend to speak about what came later, she said. She expected to be home within the week. She said it very lightly, and her hands on the shelf betrayed her completely. "Get lost already." Leandros' voice still sitting somewhere behind her ribs. She had never once expected him to turn into a completely different person. Only 1 week had passed for her, she said, and it still did not feel real. 10 years, Gideon said, is a very long time for anybody to hold on to anything. More than long enough, he added, to forget a passing connection entirely. He was right. A whole decade had gone by here, and a great deal must have happened inside it. On the night she finally understood she was standing inside the novel, she had gone to his room fully intending to tell him every single part of it. He was at his desk writing letters, and he never once looked up at the door. She stood outside with her hand resting on the frame and her heart going hard. And she found when it came to it that she simply could not do it. Not with a face on him she had never seen him wear in all the time she knew him. Besides, Gideon reminded her, Lilianshas would be visiting this manor before long. She ran a hand along the edge of a shelf and made herself say it out loud. So she ought to be preparing to go back to her own world as well. It would be bad, she said, if this world changed course because of an outsider like her. Gideon watched her for a long moment without offering any answer at all. If she was someone who would vanish from this world, he said, she should influence it as little as possible. Until then, he asked, might the two of them talk whenever she had a little free time? Conversation with her, he said, was proving unexpectedly enjoyable. The 6th day came, and she woke up in a servant's bed for the 6th time. It felt as though she had lived out an entire week of Hazel Reeve's actual life. Mornings attending Leandros, afternoons cleaning Silas's studio, the study whenever there was time. Silas had noticed her from the very first day she was beginning to suspect. She kept her head down, kept working, and tried to be as invisible as possible. He sat in front of the easel with a brush held loosely between 2 fingers. He looked serious when he painted. The novel had described him once as a genius, a free spirit who handed the airship to his younger brother early and walked away from it. "Hey, peeping girl," he said without turning around. "Stop staring and come over here." "Did you call for me?" she said in her most carefully neutral servant's voice. What did she think of it? He wanted her honest opinion, and he wanted it now. "Pardon," she said, and looked up at him with a dustcloth still in her hand. Up close he was not quite Leandros. The difference was somewhere around the mouth. "Handsome," said some entirely traitorous part of her brain, out of nowhere. He looked back at her with an expression of polite and total confusion. He already knew that, he said. He had meant the painting on the easel. She had studied mathematics, she said. She had no connection to art whatsoever. He caught her by the wrist before she could get out of the room. He had not asked her to appraise it. Her personal impression would be quite enough. He was expecting a very great deal from a woman holding a dirty cloth. So she stopped and turned around and actually looked at the thing properly. It was a lovely painting, she said, but she would not want to buy it. Why not, he said, and put the brush down. Like the difference, she said, between an alley at night with a cat in it and one without. Put a red flower here, she said, and pointed at the green mass of the tree. That flower does not bloom on that tree. She knew. She meant a little imagination. He turned back to the canvas and said nothing at all for a long moment. A stroke of red went across the green and then stopped halfway. And then another one, and then several, until the whole thing changed weight. His hand came to a stop at the very edge of the frame. This is, he said, and did not seem to have the rest of the sentence ready. Not bad at all, he decided, and looked at it for a while longer. Hazel Reeves, she said when he asked. 20 years old, sir. Hazel, he repeated, and then his whole face changed. Right. He happened to need an assistant, he said, and he would be leaving it to her. She had work already. He suggested she give half of it to another maid. But she knew nothing about art. He was not asking for her opinion on that. Absolutely not, she said, with rather more force than a servant should use. Did she think, he asked, leaning down toward her, that she had been given a choice? He would go and tell his brother now, before the man assumed he was chasing a maid. Sir, wait, she said. Relax, he told her. He would explain it all properly himself. The door closed behind him, and she stood in the studio holding a brush. How exactly, she asked the empty room, had things ended up like this? 2 days later, she was summoned to the study on the first floor. Gold coins went scattering across the floorboards and rolled to a stop at her feet. She stood in the middle of the room and did not pick up a single one of them. Her eyes filled before she could do anything at all to stop them. Get out of my manor, Leandro said, right now tonight and do not come back. And the whole room went white and soft at the edges around her. Leandros was writing at his desk when the housekeeper showed her into the study. She stood just inside the doorway with her hands folded and waited to be spoken to. Why call her all the way up here if he was not going to say anything at all? The silence only made the waiting considerably worse than the conversation would be. His brother had told him something, he said at last, that he required an assistant. He had asked her something of that nature, she admitted. Was she married? He asked. Not yet, she said, and had no idea where the question was going. Had she met his brother inside this manor? She said that she had. If she were to find herself carrying his brother's child, he continued evenly. She looked up at him, not yet knowing that his next sentence would take everything. That child would grow up without ever once knowing who its birth mother had been. Surely, he said, she did not wish for a tragedy of that particular kind. A discarded dress on a tiled floor and a shape wrapped in dark cloth beside it. Get out of my manor, right now. The words were still sitting in her chest. Her heart went hard and cold, and something in her simply stopped being afraid. His brother's frivolous and impulsive behavior troubled him constantly, he said. As master of this house, he could no longer afford to overlook any of it. Least of all, he added, if the man was indulging in intimate relations with a maid. I see, she said, and did not trust herself to say very much else. So he thought her one of those maids trying to latch on to a nobleman for money. She should name any country she wished to go to, he said. He did not mind where. With respect, she told him, he could not send her to the place she wanted to go. What? He said, and it was the first genuine reaction she had got out of him. And Lord Silas was nothing to her. She already had somebody in her heart. If there was nothing else, she said, she would excuse herself and get back to work. The study door shut behind her considerably harder than she had actually intended. She got roughly 10 steps down the corridor before her legs gave out on her. Why had she let herself get worked up over a man who did not know her name? Of course he did not recognize her. There was no reason on earth that he should. But it hurt anyway, and understanding exactly why it hurt did not help at all. Idiot, she told the window, and could not have said which of them she meant. Inside the study, the Duke had not moved from the place where she had left him. He stood there with an unfinished letter drying under his hand on the desk. I already have someone in my heart. He heard it again, and then again after that. That face. There was something about that maid's face he could not put down. What an irritating woman, he said, to a room that contained nobody at all. The sky over the estate was completely clear the following morning. The manor sat in its cut gardens looking exactly like an illustration from a novel. Why, she said, with her forehead more or less on the library table. Why was she still in this world at all after everything she had done to fit in? Gideon drank his tea beside her and let her finish the whole complaint. He set the cup back down on its saucer before he gave her any answer. Ever since that day, the Duke kept looking at her, and it was becoming unbearable. Leandros had vanished all at once, she said. There had to be some kind of condition. A condition, Gideon repeated, and turned the idea over without much enthusiasm. There was one thing he wanted to ask her. Why was she so certain she could go back? Because Leandros had returned to his own world, she said. It was obvious. A teacup came down onto a saucer with a small, precise sound. 10 years ago, he said, while Leandros was living inside her other world. He was missing here, and the place where they eventually found him again. Men had searched the hills for him all that night with lanterns and dogs. Was the exact site of the accident where his carriage overturned in a landslide, and he was found lying in the wreckage of it completely and impossibly unharmed. But she had arrived in this world by an entirely different route from his. Which meant, he said, that the conditions were never the same to begin with. Perhaps the version of her over there had died. That could not possibly be true. It must not be true. She said it out loud, twice, as though that settled it. Then something changed in the air of the whole house, and both of them felt it. So she was going to end up meeting her after all, whatever she did to avoid it. The real protagonist of this entire story had just stepped down from her carriage. A woman lifting a wide-brimmed hat in a garden full of white flowers. The reason, in the end, that this whole world had been written in the first place. It was as though only the patch of ground she was standing on had been given light. She was not insignificant, Gideon said. To him she was by far the more remarkable one. Please do not touch her hair without permission, she said, batting his hand away. A ribbon slipped loose somewhere above them, and something white came down through the branches. And a man in a dark coat looked up at exactly the right moment to see it. A hand closed around a strip of blue silk in midair without any apparent effort. Leandros stood in the sunlight with the ribbon caught between his fingers. Liliancha's Eden looked up at him with white flowers coming down all around her. Was that a scene from the novel as well? Gideon asked, watching her face. Their first meeting, she said. It had been described in a very great deal of detail. Liliancha's arriving at this house meant the story was beginning in earnest at last. And what if, after all of this, she still could not find a way back home? What if the reason was that she was already lying dead on a pavement over there? Had her sister truly gone that far? She could not make herself finish the thought. Mireille! Somebody shouted, and a hand caught her by the arm. She had been going down the stairs backward without noticing she was moving. She was bleeding, Gideon said, and turned her hand over to look at it. She had opened her palm on the window frame and had not felt a thing. Nothing had been decided yet, he told her. It was best not to think too deeply about it. If she only knew what condition she was in over there, she would not be this frightened. There might, he said slowly, be one person alive who could answer that for her. However, she was going to need money for it, and a very great deal of it. She walked the corridors the next morning with her hand wrapped up in clean linen. One of his own kind read the stars, Gideon said, and could see her state in the other world. The letter went out with the afternoon post, sealed and addressed to nowhere she recognized. Even the wealthiest could barely arrange to meet the man. She should not expect very much. Even inside a book, she thought bitterly, absolutely everything came down to money. Leandros was reading by the window when she brought the afternoon tea in. She had expected it, but he truly did not glance in her direction even once. She set the cup down on the desk beside him with her bandaged hand. And his eyes moved for the first time since she had entered the room. Could she even do her work properly with a hand in that condition, he asked. Endure it, she told herself. This is a class-based society, and you are a maid. It would heal quickly and would not affect her work. Get out, he said. Until that healed, he told her, she was not to come anywhere near this room. He was not going to dismiss her over a cut hand. Surely he was not going to do that. Silas was painting when she came into the studio with her thoughts elsewhere. She stood by the door, radiating an almost visible cloud of misery. Money. Where on earth was a maid inside a novel supposed to find money? A memory arrived, unhelpfully, of gold coins scattering across a study floor. She really should have picked every last one of them up when they were offered. Was something troubling her, Silas asked. She had been sighing this entire time. Nothing in particular, she said, in the least convincing voice she owned. Lying is not good, he said, with absolutely no idea what he had just done to her. She pushed his hand away from her face with rather more force than necessary. Down in the courtyard below the window, a carriage had arrived at the steps. Ah, he said, looking down at it. The daughter of the Branmere Trading Company, Lilianchas Eden, 24 years old. Was there anything else she was curious about? As if she had anything to trade for it. She already knew why the woman had come. 5% of every sale went to this house, and that contract would decide more than money. Her father usually delivered the ledgers, but his chronic illness had worsened last winter. So Lillian, the next head of the company, had come the whole way in his place. You could tell at a glance she had been raised properly. His Grace surely thought so too. Leandros, Silas said cheerfully, was going to fall in love with her fairly soon. Yes, exactly as the original story goes, and there was nothing she could do about it. She swallowed the entire argument whole and said absolutely nothing. Him? He was joking. That man had not the slightest interest in women of any kind. That was before he met Lillian. It was the entire structural spine of the story. What she actually said out loud was nothing at all, and it was infuriating. He was a strange one, Silas said. He claimed he could not marry any other woman. 10 years ago, he met a woman in a dream, and he had never once let go of her. A famous story. He was lovesick for years. A new maid would not know about it. It was the first time she had ever learned a grown man could fall ill over a dream. 10 years ago. She stood there holding a brush she had forgotten she was holding. I would never forget you, big sister. Could he possibly have meant her? They had spent 10 days together. 10 days out of an entire human life. She had only been thinking, she said, that his Grace was surprisingly romantic. Romantic, Silas said. Insane was very considerably closer to the truth. She was still turning the whole thing over when evening came down over the manor. No. Whether he remembered her or not changed absolutely nothing about her situation. She did not even know when she would be permitted to go back home again. Then a voice somewhere behind her in the corridor said, "Excuse me, miss." Lilianchas Eden was standing in the middle of the wreckage of a very large vase. She had only been trying to look at the stars, she said, and her hand had touched it. Leave the rest of it to her, Mireille said, and please go up and rest. No, she would help too. This was her work, Mireille told her firmly. She could not possibly allow a guest of the house to help clean anything. Lillian stood there, twisting her hands together and not moving toward the stairs. Her fingers closed hard in the fabric of her skirt and then finally let go. I'm so sorry, she said, and went away down the corridor at last. Clean it up quickly and go back. She was far more tired tonight than she should be. The shards lay scattered right across the tiles like a spill of broken ice. She knelt down on the cold floor and started gathering them into her apron. And then a pair of boots came to a stop at the very edge of the lamplight. She did not look up at them. She stayed exactly where she was on the floor. The lamp above her threw her own shadow long across the polished stone. He walked straight past her without a word, and never once looked down. Was he still holding a grudge over what she had said to him the other day? Then her hands went completely still on the tiles. Wait, this scene. In the original, Lillian is the one kneeling here when Leandros walks past her. That is precisely where the two of them begin to dislike one another. Two small lights drifting slowly apart from each other in the dark. And that is where eventually the two of them begin to fall in love instead. Lillian was supposed to be kneeling on this floor tonight, not her, never her. The whole story had quietly come untied in her hands while she was holding it. Blood was running down her wrist and dripping steadily onto the tiles. She had not felt the glass go into her palm at any point at all. Because of me, she thought, and could not make herself think anything else. The garden was full of hard summer light the following morning. Taking an entire day off simply because the weather happened to be pleasant. If he stayed indoors painting on a day like this, Silas said, heaven would punish him. So this is where you were, called a bright voice from somewhere behind her. Lilianchas came down the garden path with an enormous armful of roses. Thank you so much for last night, she said, as though nothing at all had gone wrong. She had bought a new vase. Did it look like yesterday's one? It was very pretty. She held the whole arrangement out toward her with both hands. And Mireille felt the entire story tilt one more degree underneath her feet. If it simply went back in its usual place, would His Grace even notice the difference? This was the scene out of the original, and it was happening to the wrong person. The one meant to receive this was Leandros. She had to steer it back onto course. Would it not be better, she asked, for the young lady to give it to him herself? He already knew the vase had broken. She had run into him while she was clearing it away. If he heard it was a gift from her, Mireille said, she was certain he would be pleased. Lillian looked down at the roses lying in the crook of her arm. Did she really think so? She sounded about 19 years old when she said it. It was a vase of flowers. She had never in her life seen anyone refuse flowers. Said Lillian, and chewed thoughtfully on the side of her thumb. Then she would tie a ribbon on it. He would be even happier that way, would he not? By the way, what was her name? Hazel Reeve. Then Miss Reeve, she said. She was already holding out a very small box with both hands. Open it, she said, and stood there beaming in the sunlight. A thank you gift for the night before, a pale pendant on a fine dark cord. She could not possibly accept it. She had only been doing her actual job. She had caused her trouble, Lillian insisted, and would feel awful leaving it like this. But, Mireille started. Then she would go and see His Grace immediately, Lillian said. Miss, she called after her, and got absolutely nowhere with it. And the girl was already gone down the path with the roses and the ribbon. What was she supposed to do now? She had wanted to avoid meeting her entirely. She stood alone in the garden holding a gift she had done nothing to earn, so that Leandros's fate would not bend any further out of its proper shape. She wanted him happy, whatever it ended up costing her personally to arrange. Gideon was in the library, reaching for something on a very high shelf. She watched him through the glass for a moment before she went in. What exactly was he doing up there, she asked, in a house full of servants? This morning's replacement was less efficient than she was. He was cleaning in their place. Had there been any reply yet, she asked, from that friend of his? She should not compare this world's post with the one she had grown up using. More importantly, he said, turning around, what exactly was she hiding? She had made a mistake somewhere in the last 60 seconds, and she knew it. He came around the end of the bookshelf toward her without hurrying. Might he look into her memories, he asked, with his hand already half raised. A single strand of her hair caught between two of his fingers. I see, he said eventually, and did not sound especially pleased about any of it. The important part, she said, was how Leandros reacted to it afterward. Miss Reeve, called a voice from the doorway, and both of them turned. She had asked every servant in the house, Lillian said, and finally found her. Thank you so much. His Grace had accepted the gift, apparently without hesitation. Impossible. In the original, he refused her vase and refused it extremely coldly. He had misunderstood the whole thing. He believed the maid had broken it. She had to make Lillian leave a bad impression, or nothing would proceed as written. His Grace really was a kind person, Lillian said. Yes, Mireille agreed. He was. Gideon said absolutely nothing at all, standing in the light from the window. And then he simply walked out of the room and left them there. She caught up with him halfway down the corridor outside. She should return to her post soon, he said, not knowing what waited behind the next door. If a reply came from his friend, he would tell her about it the same day. Though it would be best for everybody if she disappeared before then. Then a voice came through the door beside them. I told you I would not do it. That voice. Both of them stopped walking at exactly the same moment. His Majesty had ordered an engagement arranged within this year without fail. Why did the room on the other side of that door sound quite so hostile? Otherwise, he would proceed with the proposal from the second princess of the Frey Kingdom. So the man in there had been sent directly from the imperial family itself. Then he would request an audience with His Majesty, Leandros said. He would not be received unless it was to announce that he had chosen a bride. He was tired, Leandros said, of hearing about these meaningless duties. She should stop him. Her hand was already flat against the door. He says he cannot marry any other woman. Silas's voice out of the studio. It seemed, Leandros said, that they still believed a succubus had hold of him even now. Why not perform another exorcism then? Being bound hand and foot while a cross was carved into his chest had been quite the novel experience after all. She stood behind the door with her hand pressed hard over her own mouth. He pulled his coat open in front of the man, and she saw what had been cut into him. Not at all, Your Grace, the officer said. He had already written to the monastery. If being near women was difficult for him, they suggested he spend some time there. A black envelope with a heavy red seal held out across the room. It changed hands in the middle of the study without either man looking down. He took it and did not open it and did not look at it at all. How ridiculous. They wanted him to learn how badly this body craved a woman. It was no use, he said. 10 years ago, he had already given everything he had to her. "Stop this," the officer said. "The woman called Mireille is nowhere in the Empire." "Do not say that name with your filthy mouth," Leandros told him very quietly. "Your Grace?" the man managed, with a hand closed around his collar. Just as he had said, he was still possessed by a demon, so what of it? What did they intend to carve into this body next, exactly? He wanted a number. "Answer me," he said, and the whole room seemed to shrink around the two of them. And then somebody knocked twice, politely, on the study door. "Who is there?" he shouted and crossed the room and pulled it open. There was nobody at all standing in the corridor outside when he did. She was already running, and she did not stop until she reached the library. The library door came open hard enough to bang against the shelf behind it. "Gideon," she said, and her voice did not sound like her own voice. "What had her in such a hurry?" he began. "You knew," she said. "You knew all along." He had known that Leandros still remembered her, and he had said nothing. He caught her by the wrist, and he did not deny one single part of it. "You liar," she said, and it came out of her almost like a sob. As this family's advisor, he said, he could not let the marriage be delayed further. He said it perfectly calmly, which somehow made all of it considerably worse. That did not mean he had to lie. She saw the scars on his chest, did she not? She stopped exactly where she stood, with her hand still caught in his. After Leandros came back here, he suffered fevers and hallucinations for 2 full years. The old duke summoned every famous physician anywhere in the empire to his bedside. And every single one of them looked at the boy and shook his head. So the duke did the other thing, the thing nobody in the house talks about. He called in a clergyman and had an exorcism performed on his own son, choosing a method that would mark a boy's chest for the rest of his natural life. How could anybody do something that awful to their own child, she said. Rumors said the Duchess had taken her own life and her son was demon-touched. The late Duke, Gideon said, had no other choice left available to him. He had realized Leandros was telling the truth, and he had not stopped them. Even if he had told the truth, he said, not one living person would have believed it. Before she experienced it herself, would the old her have believed a word of it? Those 2 years, he said, and stopped for a moment before he went on, were a painful time for everybody who had to stand there and watch over him. Just hearing that he had been branded felt like her heart being pulled out whole. And he must have suffered a very great deal more than this, in silence, for years. Tears that do not fall pile up here, and in time they harden like stone. He had been alone, if only she could hold him again the way she had that night. Even after that was carved into him, he had given 10 years to finding her again. 2 hands closed around each other in the last of the afternoon light. But one day, Gideon said, she was going to disappear out of here entirely. She had absolutely no answer for that, and both of them knew it. So do not make him suffer the same thing twice, he said, if she truly cared for him. She walked out to the far field where nobody would come looking for a maid. She knew Leandros was destined to marry Lillian and to live happily afterward. And she was an intruder who had barged headfirst into a fate already written down. And still she had left those wounds on his body and on everything underneath it. Then something enormous and extremely warm shoved her hard from behind. She went straight down into the long grass with her skirts over her knees. What on earth was it doing out in a place like this? She asked it. A white horse looked back down at her with absolutely no answer whatsoever. Stop that, she said, laughing in spite of herself. It tickles. Yes, yes. It was telling her not to sit out here feeling sorry for herself. Next time the two of them met, she promised she would bring it a sugar cube. If she was even still here by then, which she had no way at all of knowing. She walked back toward the house as the light went out of the sky behind her. A hand came down on her shoulder, and she nearly went into the grass again. A man was standing back under the trees beside the white horse watching her go. And he was gone again before she had properly finished turning around. A small white box lay forgotten in the grass some way behind her. Night and a storeroom full of crates lit by one narrow window. She went through every single one of them on her hands and knees. The necklace that Lillian had given her was gone, and it was not anywhere here. A thank you gift, and the only hope she had of ever paying a profit. This was the last place she had stopped, so it had to be somewhere in this room. Somebody was standing in the doorway behind her, watching her search the floor. She had been trying to find a necklace she lost, she said from her knees. It had fallen near the well, he said, and held it out to her without comment. Thank you very much, she said, and took it out of a gloved hand. She must have dropped it out there when the horse knocked her over. But why on earth had it been sitting in the Duke of Etosina's hand? Later that night, wine was going into a glass in a very dark room. She had heard from the other servants that he took medicine for the insomnia. Mixing something like that with alcohol could not possibly be good for him. "Your Grace," she said, "they say taking medicine with wine is bad for the health." "Where are you from?" he asked her, without looking up from the glass. "Pardon," she said, and every part of her went very carefully still. She had someone in her heart. He was asking where exactly that person came from. "He was from this empire," she said, choosing every single word with enormous care. They had met recently, but he felt like somebody she had known a very long time. He watched her say it, and something behind his face did not move at all. Had the injury on her hand healed? Yes, it had never been a serious wound. He also had somebody in his heart, he said, though he could no longer meet her. If the person she loved died one day, he asked, would she find somebody new? If the woman standing in this room were Takahashi Mirai, she would have said never. She was not permitted to be Takahashi Mirai tonight, or on any night after it. But she thought about the shape of the scars under his shirt, and she chose. She thought about 10 years of fever and a cross and a father who allowed it. Yes, she said, if that were genuinely the only choice left to her. If it means you can be happy, I will tell as many lies as this takes. They say the pain of parting is healed by a new meeting. I see, he said. He set the glass down, stood up to leave, and did not get very far at all. She stood looking down at a duke asleep on the floor of his own study. She fetched a blanket and closed the door behind her extremely quietly, and walked back through a house in which every single window was dark. If it means you can be happy. She repeated it until it stopped sounding like a lie. The night went thin and white at the edges somewhere toward dawn. A month passed, and her first summer inside that world came steadily closer. Silas had set his easel up in the middle of the rose garden. She had assumed he would go out drinking again, since the weather was fine. Lillian was already standing there beside him in a wide straw hat. The two of them had grown really quite close over the past few weeks. In the original, Lillian becomes the woman who gives Silas his inspiration, which means his hopeless, entirely one-sided love for her is about to begin, and there is not one thing anybody can do to stop it. She closed her eyes in the sunlight for a second and made herself walk over. What was she doing over there? Silas called. Hurry up and come here. She had taken so long coming back that he assumed she had gone to dig a well. She had missed her chance to retreat, and those two needed time alone together. Look at this, he said, and turned the canvas around toward her. Lillian had recommended lapis lazuli, and that was not a cheap material at all. He did not want Lillian to feel embarrassed about it. What did she think? She thought it sounded good, a little praise, and Silas would think well of the woman. There was a silence in the rose garden that went on slightly too long. Silas smiled at her without one single trace of warmth anywhere in it. That was a lie, he said. No, she said, it was not. It absolutely was not. Lillian turned around under her hat to look at the pair of them. Then tell him what she thought of this one. He had painted it at a tavern. It had a lovely atmosphere, Lillian said. She felt she could hear every voice in it. Said Silas, and did not look remotely satisfied by the answer. Was she the same, he asked, turning to Mirai. Did she think so as well? That is, she began, and could not find the end of the sentence anywhere. Listen. Her face gave her away every single time she opened her mouth to lie. It seemed, he said, that she was the one with the better eye of the two. Lillian looked from one of them to the other and said nothing. Mirai felt the ground tilt one more degree away from the story she had read. And then Lillian smiled at her anyway, which was somehow very much worse. So what she had felt about the painting, Lillian said, was not wrong at all. Lillian looked down at her own gloved hands for a moment. Well, said Silas after a pause. He supposed that was true enough. She had been thinking this for a while, Lillian said. Miss Reeve was very kind. Kind? This one? He told her she did not know the woman at all. She had told him straight to his face that his painting had no commercial value. She was certain, Lillian said, that this was her own particular way of complimenting him. Please, Mirai said, would the two of them just talk to each other without her? She walked back up the path toward the house on her own, and somewhere on the floor above her a window was standing open. Leandros turned away from it before she could look up and see him. A portrait hung in the corridor inside a very heavy gilt frame. He walked straight past it without slowing down even slightly. That evening, the dining hall was laid for three and everything was polished. She had heard, Lillian said, that the Itasina territory was famous for its wine. Whenever her father's visits here were arranged, he always looked forward to it. "Is that so?" said the Duke, and that was the entire extent of his answer. Lillian waited for anything more at all, and nothing whatsoever came. But she was new to wine, she said, so she could not really tell good from bad. They said the wine made here was sweet as sugar. Was that actually true? Their conversation was not continuing. It was not even really starting. In the original novel, these two are awkward with each other in this exact scene. The problem was that only Lillian was doing any talking, only her, all evening. Mireille stood against the wall with the other maids and watched it fail slowly. It was far too one-sided to keep standing there and watching any longer. The reason it had gone wrong was standing in a corridor 2 nights ago. A man walking past a woman kneeling on a floor and never once looking down. If nothing had begun because of her, then tonight's accident was absolutely necessary. But that accident was going to tear Leandros open all over again in front of everyone. Knowing what happens next is not your responsibility. Please do not feel guilty. Gideon had told her that, and the scars on Leandros' chest said something else. If it was her doing, then she was the only person alive who could put it right. The dining hall doors opened, and the last dish of the evening came in. She had asked the kitchen for something from her own homeland, Lillian said. She hoped very much that it would suit his Grace's taste. "Your Grace," Mireille said from her place against the wall. "Your Grace?" He was already on his feet, and his hands would not stay still at his sides. The sea in her homeland was beautiful, Lillian said. At sunset, it looked like a painting. She would be glad if his Grace could find the time to visit it one day. Mireille stood by the wall and felt absolutely everything in the room stop moving. The sea. It was the only memory the two of them actually shared. And by a very long way, the most painful thing that he owned. "Miss Eden," he said, and set his glass down on the tablecloth. "I do not go to the sea." That was the entire answer, and there was nothing after it. "Ah," Lillian said, and looked down at the plate in front of her. A knock came at the dining hall door, and a footman put his head in. "What is it?" the Duke said without turning around in his chair. It seemed that what the young lady had requested was finally ready. Lillian brightened all over again, and Mireille felt something cold start. She had worried she might never have the chance to serve food from her home, so she had gone down and made a request directly to the kitchen staff. The maids came in through the far door carrying covered silver dishes. Mireille glanced at the nearest tray and felt the first real touch of it. The cover came off with a flourish directly in front of the Duke. She hoped very much, Lillian said, that it suited his taste. Fish, threaded whole, one after another onto long iron skewers. "Your Grace," Mireille said and started forward from the wall. His heart was going hard enough that she could actually see it in his throat. A hand, a shaft of wood, a box carried into a tent on a battlefield, and a word he had last heard 10 years ago, in a language of another country. The chair went over backward, and the man who rose from it was nobody in that room recognized. "Stay away from me," he said to a woman who had not moved at all. "If you come near me," he said, "I will cut you down where you stand." She could not get involved any further. The only person who could comfort him now was Lillian, and everybody in that room except Lillian already knew it. If it happened, he would open his heart to her, and the story would run properly again. And there was absolutely no possible way she could stand there and watch him like that. She was already moving before she had consciously decided anything at all. Both of them went down together among the scattered skewers and broken china. Somebody's hands closed on Lillian's skirt and dragged her back out of reach. He was breathing like a man who had run an extremely long way to get here. "Miss, are you all right?" she said. "Yes," Lillian said. "Yes, I am fine." Lillian was crying and had not actually noticed that she was doing it. It was the trauma he had brought back with him from the battlefield. She could not go to him. She made herself stay where she was and say nothing. He knelt on the floor of his own dining hall with something sharp still in his fist. And then Lillian crossed the room and put both arms around him. "This is fine," Mireille told herself from the far side of the room. This was the right thing. This was exactly what was supposed to happen here. From here, the two of them would be drawn together and reach a happy ending. Somebody called her borrowed name, and she did not turn around to answer it. She stood in the doorway with her back to every part of it. And the trauma would fade into a memory he could one day laugh about with somebody. She went out through the servant's door and let it close behind her. Behind her, a woman in green held a duke on the floor while he shook. "I did not make the wrong choice," she said, to a corridor with nobody in it. It rained continuously all the following day, from before dawn until dark. The roses along the garden wall went heavy and low with all the water. She sat down among them in the wet and finally stopped pretending anything. People's hearts turn delicate on rainy days, and hers had never been sturdy. An umbrella came over her head from somewhere above and simply stayed there. It was the perfect night for painting, Silas said, standing in the downpour. She did not have anything like the strength left to argue with him about it. A bottle came out of somewhere inside his coat and was held out toward her. She had left in the middle of work. If they learned she drank, she could be dismissed. Then say he ordered her to. Did she even understand the state she was in? He put the bottle into her hands and did not give her the option of refusing. Work was hard, she said. That was all it was. Work had simply been hard. She had only just left her home, and this was her first post as a maid anywhere. There are a great many different reasons for a person to be sad, he said. He thought even adults should be allowed to cry whenever they wanted to. How long did she intend to keep standing over him? She should sit down already. Stop arguing and sit, he said. She was starting to make him worry. Thank you, she said, sitting down on the very edge of the sofa. Very much. How had he got that injury on his face, she asked. This, he said. This one. He had caused a scene in a tavern, been punched, and thrown out into the street. Was it all right to do that to a noble? Nobody in this territory treated him as one. A man mocked by his brother at home looks ridiculous, acting proud out in public. More importantly, he said, what had happened in the dining hall? It sounded loud. A dish had come out on skewers, she said, and his grace was startled by it. Anyway, drink, he told her. He thought it would settle her down a little. A woman in green, holding a man on a polished floor while he shook. She drank, which she had not intended to do at any point that evening. And then she went on drinking for considerably longer than she meant to. She had not needed to do it that fast. She felt calmer already, she said. He watched her over the neck of the bottle and started laughing at her. She really was a strange one, he said, and shook his head at the ceiling. Was she? She was a little different from other people, apparently. She sat in the lamplight with wet hair and did not bother correcting him. For her own sake, he said. She should forget what happened earlier tonight. She worried about things that had not happened. How could he possibly know that? Was he a prophet as well, she asked him. Hardly, he said, and laughed again. She looked calculating, he said, but she was actually extremely simple. Well, he rather liked that about her, he said, and she nearly dropped the bottle. He would paint her. She should sit there and tell him what she actually felt. She had skipped work this afternoon, and she had been drinking his wine. It would be inconvenient not to have an excuse ready, would it not? She was considerably more considerate than he had expected her to be. Than he expected, she repeated, and did not know what to do with her face. But secrets are weaknesses. Was it fair for only one of them to show one? So he wanted her to say something too. She had a cheeky side, apparently. Fine, he said, sketching. If she spoke first, then he would tell her his. Rain ran down the tall window behind her in long, unbroken lines. She looked at the glass for a very long moment before she said anything. The truth was, she said, that she once spent the night with a man she had just met. His pencil stopped completely still against the surface of the paper. She had spent the night with somebody she had only just met that same day. He looked at her over the top edge of the easel without any expression. And then he tilted his head slowly to one side. Was that all of it? Was she trying to make some kind of fool out of him? This was an enormous secret to her, she said, going red to the ears. If they were both adults, he said, that was hardly a strange thing to happen. She had worked up her courage to say that out loud, she informed him. She had forgotten, briefly, exactly which of the brothers she was talking to. She was sharper than usual tonight, he observed. Was she drunk already? Of course she was not drunk, she said, from behind both of her hands. He smiled down at the canvas in front of him and said nothing at all. He understood, he said. Now would she please stop moving about so much? She glanced sideways at him from her chair without turning her head. His passion for painting, at the very least, was entirely and obviously genuine. A secret, then. He had asked for one, and he was clearly going to wait. There was so much she could not tell him that she had no idea where to begin. When he was 8 years old, he said, he saw his mother hanging from the ceiling. This time the pencil did not stop moving across the paper at all. He had called out to her again and again, and she never answered him once. A small boy standing in a doorway with all the light coming from behind him, and a shape above him that would not resolve into anything else he recognized. He had been the very first person in that house to find her. And for a few minutes, the only person in the world who knew. And then he ran, because he was 8 and because that is what children do. Down a corridor that seemed at the time to have no end anywhere in it. Because he ran, he said, his father and his brother both blamed him for it. If he had called for help, if they had cut her down even slightly sooner. From that day onward, he was simply the son who had killed his own mother. She had heard this story before, from Leandros in a small apartment a lifetime ago. She had never once imagined that Silas was the one who actually saw it happen. The two of them carried exactly the same wound and not only the same face. And still they did not merely dislike each other. The two of them hated each other. Why was she looking at him like that? He asked without lifting his eyes. Did she think he was pathetic too? He was not pathetic, she said, because he had been a child at the time and children run from things. And he had been only 8 years old, which was younger than anybody remembered. A very small boy running down a corridor he would never actually leave again. His mouth opened, and for a moment, nothing at all came out of it. He must have been so frightened, she said. That was all she said. She was the first person in his entire life who had ever said that to him. The rain outside thinned out and went quiet somewhere toward morning. It was finished, he said eventually. Did she want to come and see it? She came around the side of the easel and stood looking at herself. Could he possibly make some changes to it, she asked him. Everybody wanted to be drawn prettier than they were, but it looked just like her. Make the hair thick and wavy and black, she said, and the nose rounder than that. He looked at her for a long moment over the top of the canvas. That was a very great many requests from somebody sitting for free. Was she certain? It would end up looking like a completely different person. Yes, she said. That was exactly and entirely what she wanted. He warned her not to expect the thing to ever actually be finished. She knew, she said. All the great painters were like that about their work. Something in his face shifted, and he covered it over again very quickly. She got rather interesting when she was drunk. Was she drunk? She asked. Her face was scarlet. She was going to regret all of this in the morning. Sit down, he said. He would keep drawing before the wine hit her properly. She was glad at the very least that he was able to laugh like that. If he drew her ugly, she warned him, she was going to make him fix it. Yes, yes, he said, and went on sketching without looking up. He worked on for a long time while the rain went quiet outside the window. Perhaps, he thought, he was the one who had actually got drunk tonight. She sat very still and let a stranger's face be painted over her own. Morning arrived through the window the next day like a form of punishment. It felt as though a rubber ball was bouncing around loose inside her stomach. And worse than that, her memory of the night before had holes right through it. She was never drinking again. Hazel clearly had no head for wine whatsoever. She stopped dead in the middle of the corridor with a tray in her hands. Leandros was standing in his room waiting for somebody to bring his necktie. That's right, she said out loud, and remembered all of it at once. Her hands were up at his collar before she had properly woken up. He looked down at the top of her head without saying anything. And then he took the knot out of her hands and pulled it straight himself. A finger stopped roughly an inch short of her mouth and stayed there. She stood absolutely still and did not breathe for several full seconds. Did he not like the necktie, she asked. She could easily bring another one. He undid the whole thing and started again from the beginning. No need, he said, and did not look at her in the mirror. So irritating, he told his own reflection and pulled the knot tight. Somebody knocked twice on the door of the bedroom behind them. Both of them turned toward the sound at exactly the same moment. Your Grace, said the footman, Lady Liliantius has arrived downstairs. He was already crossing the room before the man had finished speaking. Lillian was waiting for him in the hall with her head bowed low. Good day, she said. Forgive her for calling quite so early in the morning. She had wanted to apologize properly for what happened at dinner yesterday. It looked very much as though she had not slept at all that night. She had not known the circumstances, he said. There was no need to apologize. But, she started, and could not seem to get any further than that. If anything, he said, he should apologize. He was sorry for frightening her. There were a great many roses in the garden. Would she take tea if she did not mind? Yes, she said, and her whole face lit up. She would love to. So yesterday's disaster had become the thing that finally brought them closer. She could not see Leandros' face at all from where she was standing. She was entirely certain all the same that the man was smiling. The sky above the estate that morning was a hard and cloudless blue. She was an idiot. How could she possibly have forgotten something that important? Two people laughing over a canvas, and a woman with both hands on her head. Drunk or not drunk, what she had done last night was unforgivably reckless. If Leandros ever laid eyes on that particular painting, everything ended. "Lord Silas," she called, running down the steps into the garden. About that painting of a woman he drew last night. He should throw it away. A book closed quietly somewhere on the path behind her. She was still smiling when she said it, which was the worst part. "A painting of a woman," said a voice she recognized immediately. She went cold all the way down from her scalp to her feet. "Did you bring another woman into this house?" Leandros said. "And who exactly is she?" "Mireille," called a voice from the far end of the field. 3 people in a golden field and one single word hanging in the air. Leandros had heard it. There was no version of this where he had not heard it. "Mireille," he said slowly, "just who exactly are you?" But to understand that question, we have to go back to a quarrel in a rose garden. Had he brought another woman into this house? The question hung in the sunlight. No, she said, that was not it. Then what was this painting he had mentioned? Boots came across the gravel path behind her, unhurried and getting closer. What on earth was she supposed to do about any of this? How exactly was she meant to answer a question like that one? 2 men came to a stop on either side of where she was standing. Did his brother need something from his assistant? Silas asked pleasantly. 3 of them, in a rose garden, under an obscenely beautiful summer sky. Silas smiled, and it was not a smile designed to make anything better. His assistant? So he finally had somebody on his side inside this manor. He would ask again. What was this painting of a woman she drew last night? Leandros did not look down at her even once while he said it. Her fingers closed hard in the fabric of her apron and stayed there. A hand came to rest very lightly just behind her shoulder blade. He felt rather sorry for her, Silas said, standing exactly where he was. Since when had the 2 of them become close? The pair of them mocking him was touching. When he asked before, she insisted there was nothing. Had her precious lover died? What had he asked her? Enough with setting people to watch him everywhere he went. All of this would be solved, Leandros said, if he simply stopped causing problems. Did he have any idea how far this family's name had fallen because of him? The one who ruined it was him, Silas said, even with a cross cut into his chest. What did you just say to me? Leandros said, and everything went very still. It was a misunderstanding, Mireille said quickly. Lord Silas came home alone. Please believe me, she said, and had no idea why she was saying it. Leandros stopped where he was, halfway through turning away from them. And then he turned his head back toward her instead. She had been perfectly certain that he would shout at a maid for interrupting. That is right, Silas said. He had behaved himself impeccably last night. Confirm it however he liked. He would put somebody on him anyway. He did draw a woman, but she had come out of this one's imagination entirely. Wait, Mireille said, let me see, Silas went on. Black hair and a round nose. If he finished that sentence now, everything ended right here. You are as unpleasant as ever, Leandros said, and walked away across the gravel. He really had not needed to say it quite that sharply, she thought. She stood and watched him go the whole length of the courtyard, and in through the far door, carrying a suspicion he had not yet put into any words. That woman again. The thought followed him the whole way inside. The light in the corridor swallowed him up completely. He sat down at his desk and did not open a single thing on top of it. My name is Takahashi Mireille. It means beautiful mountain, she had said. He put a hand over his eyes and stayed like that for a while. And then he let himself remember, which he almost never allowed himself to do. There was a memory that had never once faded, no matter how much time passed. From 10 years ago, on the day he came back into this world again. He had woken in the wreckage of a carriage holding a ring nobody could explain. I want to remember this even after you leave. She had said that to him. He told himself for a while that it had only been a dream that felt real. But the warmth of that night, her breath, and the weight of her against him. Her existence only grew clearer and sharper as the years went on past him. 10 years and not one single detail of her had blurred at any point. Your Grace, said a voice from the doorway of the study behind him. Was he tired? Gideon asked in the tone of a man who already knew. No, he said. He had simply been thinking about something else entirely. Lord Thanatos was waiting in the reception room. Had he made contact? He had shaken the man's ungloved hand. This was not only about the marriage order. A man in black was already seated when the two of them came in. Leandros crossed the room to the table without offering any greeting at all. The man smiled at him with both of his eyes comfortably closed. It had been a long time. He did not recall being close enough for greetings. Only that he looked more tired than usual. Thanatos, the emperor's own shadow. He would now inform His Grace of the schedule for this year's national inspection. The departure was 1 week earlier than last time. There would be heavy snow. The prophet who read the stars said the southern snow would reach the calves. Every 4 years, Emperor Belos took his nobles on a pilgrimage across the provinces to inspect the borders and to remind the provincial lords exactly who held the empire. 3 months at the very least. With snow like that, considerably longer than 3. What is this? Leandros said, and picked up the second sheet of paper. A single page changed hands across the polished surface of the table. His Majesty had invited Princess Cassandra. They were to prepare a place for her. Thanatos sat back and let the silence do the rest of the work for him. The pilgrimage left this winter. The emperor wanted Leandros married before it did. Belos was a merciful ruler, and his patience had very obviously run out. Gideon set his cup down on its saucer without making any sound. Cassandra Frey, princess of a small kingdom, and once his second fiancé. A distant relative, his childhood friend, his classmate at the Imperial Academy. After the engagement was broken, she had waited and never married anybody else. Leandros stood at the tall window with his back to the whole room. If there was a young lady he was seeing with marriage in mind, it would be reported. Outside, a maid was walking the path below with a wooden box in her arms. Something startled her badly, and she looked up toward the window. His hand came up against the cold glass without him deciding to move it, and then closed hard on the frame beside it instead. Was it from that exact moment, he wondered? Was it from then? A woman with brown hair, looking straight back up at him out of the sunlight. Why did he see traces of her in that maid who did not resemble her at all? However, he thought, and did not allow himself to finish the sentence. There was no such person, he said. He would see that the schedule was unaffected. An empty studio, and a room full of canvases that nobody would ever buy. My beloved, he thought, the one I can never meet again as long as I live. The last ember of a love that had simply refused, for 10 years, to go out. To my beloved daughter, Hazel, said the first line of the letter. Was she well? How was the new post? She always used to write twice a month. She sat down on the edge of the bed and read the whole thing through twice. She had completely forgotten that Hazel Reeve also had parents who loved her. A mother this kind would know within 3 lines that a stranger had written back. And how were her own parents doing, now that she came to think about it? Were the two of them eating properly with nobody there at all to check? She folded the letter up again and made herself smile at absolutely nothing. The prophet Gideon had mentioned would know how to send her home again. She put the letter away in the drawer to wait until that day came. The gardens were being cut into elaborate shapes under a hard summer sun. That was what she had decided at any rate, sitting on that bed. But a mother who hears nothing at all from her daughter will worry regardless. Something that could stand in the place of a letter without being one. She was still thinking about it when she heard voices ahead of her on the path. No, no, said the men at the table, and not one of them would say the thing that could save her. They only ever said things that were pleasant to hear. She could not trust any of them. 2 men from the trading company looked at each other and said nothing useful. Every single person sitting at that table looked visibly troubled. The Brandmere staff had watched Lillian grow up. None of them could say anything careless. She should slip quietly past them all before anybody noticed she was standing there. What a surprise to meet her here, Lillian called. Where was she headed just now? She had finished the morning's work, she said, so she was taking a short break. A small hand closed firmly around her wrist before she could get away. When she saw her judgment the other day, Lillian said, she seemed to have very good taste. Her? Yes, Lillian said, delighted, and would not let go of her wrist. This was the exact point in the novel where Lillian is supposed to fail badly. The failure costs her a fortune and opens a deep rift between her and Leandros. And she uses it afterward as the stepping stone toward everything she becomes. So should she deliberately give the wrong opinion here and let the woman fall? If Lillian did not fail at all, would that not be better for Leandros as well? These are lovely designs, she said, and turned over to the next page. Lillian's whole face opened up like a window being thrown wide. However, she said, this one here has a corset and a full set of laces, which means that only a woman with servants can actually put the thing on. The others were light and easy. A woman who loved luxury would never choose them. She unrolled the rest of the sheets flat across the surface of the garden table. So who exactly was the customer? Commoners or the wealthy? It had to be one. Hats, dresses, shoes. She was not trying to sell all of it at once, surely. If you underestimate it, she said, a business can collapse in a single season. Her fist closed hard on the edge of the table without her noticing. Because of exactly that, she said, her own family had also. 4 people around a garden table were staring straight up at her. She was terribly sorry, she said. She had spoken very far out of turn. A maid lecturing a young lady. It would not be strange to be punished for it. A pair of small embroidered shoes came around the table toward her. Not at all, Lillian said. Thank you. That was the advice she needed most. Not at all, Mireille managed to say, and did not lift her head, and felt the story move one more step away from the book she had read. She had a good eye, if she did not mind, from now on as well. She was sorry, Mireille said. She had work as Lord Silas's assistant this afternoon. And then she took the coward's option and simply fled up the path. Behind her, Lillian stood alone on the gravel holding the rolled-up designs. She wanted to be closer to her, and the woman would not open up. Did she hate her? That afternoon, there was a fire burning out in the far grounds of the estate. Canvases went into it one after another, and nobody was standing beside it. She had never asked what became of the portrait he drew of her that night. Burn all of this, said a note left on the studio table in his handwriting. He had vanished from the manor entirely, leaving nothing behind but that. She wanted to ask Gideon about it and could not find him anywhere either. Then something enormous hit her hard in the back of the head. The white horse standing behind her looked extremely pleased with itself. It was her. She had been carrying these around ever since the last time. She held both hands out flat with the sugar cubes sitting on her palms. It was a shame. If she had her phone, she would take 100 photographs. She lay back in the long grass and let the sun do whatever it liked. Now that she looked closely, there were no marks on the harness anywhere at all. Last time she had assumed somebody had simply taken the reins off her for the day. Wait, she said, what are you doing? I'm going to fall over. And she went straight over backward into the grass with her skirts everywhere. Sorry, she said. That was the last one. Too many sweets is bad for a horse. That was all for today, she announced from flat on her back. Then the horse lifted its head suddenly and looked at something past her. What are you looking at? She said, and rolled over to follow its eyes. A man was standing perfectly still at the far edge of the field. She was lying flat on her back in the grass in front of the Duke of Atosina. He walked toward the horse and did not remark on any part of it. Was that horse's owner Leandros? She asked, scrambling upright. She admitted, been giving his horse rather a lot of sugar cubes. And absolutely everything in the world stopped moving at once. So this is where you were, Gideon called, holding something up over his head. And then he saw who else was standing there and went completely still. What do I do, she thought. What on earth do I do now? A single word hung in the golden air of that field, and not one of the 3 of them moved. What was she supposed to do now? Gideon, she thought desperately. Gideon, do something! You have been drinking, Gideon observed, walking calmly across the grass toward the Duke. There is no problem, Leandros answered. No reaction whatsoever. Nothing at all in his face. Before the capital and the pilgrimage, Gideon said, he ought to reduce the wine and the medicine. The Duke looked at him for a long moment without answering a single word to any of it. Did he dislike being lectured? Gideon asked, entirely unbothered by the silence in front of him. He still seemed to regard him, Leandros said, as a child who could not tell left from right. Even 100-year-old elder, Gideon replied, was nothing more than a child from where he stood. Mireille stood there with her heart slamming against her ribs and waited for the axe to come down. There was one thing, Leandros said at last, that he wanted to ask before they went inside. Go ahead by all means, Gideon said, smiling pleasantly at him under the trees. Surely, Leandros said, he was not intending to come along on the pilgrimage as well. That would be elder abuse, Gideon laughed, and the whole field seemed to breathe out at once. A hand came up and stroked the ear of the white horse standing patiently between them. More importantly, Leandros said, He should stop calling that name quite so familiarly. And then he walked away across the golden field without another word to either of them. Gideon let out a long breath. Mireille stared at him. That name he had shouted just now. The footsteps went away over the grass and did not come back toward them. He stopped at the far edge of the field beside the white horse and stood there a while. How strange, he said, to nobody in particular, with one hand on the animal's neck. For Gideon of all people to call a household maid by a name quite that familiar. Back at the manor, Mireille made a noise that nobody in that house would have called dignified. "The pony," she managed to say, holding on to the edge of a table. "The pony is called—" He had named the horse after her. The man had actually gone and named a horse after her. He had not intended anything of the sort at the start. The pony had been a gift from Gideon. Leandros had seemed to be in so much pain that Gideon hoped the animal might carry some of it. But he had muttered her name in front of that horse so many times over so many years. A young man standing alone in a field, saying one word to something that could never answer him. And the horse lifted its head every single time she heard it, until it belonged to her. Until she came to recognize Mireille as her own name and would answer to nothing else at all. And to make her come, apparently, you were required to call her big sister Mireille. "Are you all right?" Gideon asked, visibly holding back an enormous amount of laughter. "That aside," she said, glaring at him. "Was the pilgrimage not supposed to be in the winter? Once the schedule is announced, every provincial lord goes to the capital to negotiate his taxes." "However," Gideon said, and his voice changed, "that is not what actually matters today." A reply had arrived at last, from the friend he had written 2 months ago. She nearly took his hand off getting the letter out of it. A scroll tied with a red ribbon sitting on a tiled floor in a room somewhere far away. The idea that a foreigner had come from outside this world was a hard story to believe. But if the goal had been to rouse his curiosity, then Gideon had succeeded quite splendidly. Payment, however, was another matter entirely. He did not show his ability to anybody for free. A man who lives forever, demanding money. What an absolutely shameless miser, she said. Among all the prophets, Gideon said, that one values his own ability the most highly. Once she met him in person, she would understand within a minute what kind of man he was. Once his friend understood her circumstances, he should not ask for anything outrageous. The two of them were not secretly in this together, were they? Of course not, he laughed. That aside, the Emperor's right hand had come to see Leandros, which was not good news for her. Princess Cassandra's name had first come up somewhere after the 3rd chapter began. "Yes," Gideon said, watching her face very carefully. Exactly so. She was scheduled to arrive in the Empire sometime before the autumn leaves fell. It seemed a great many guests would be visiting the ducal house by the end of that summer. Autumn leaves. The prophet was coming when the leaves turned red as well, she remembered. Was Princess Cassandra, she asked, choosing her words with rather more care than usual. Perhaps Liliantius's rival for the affections of the male lead of this story. She began as a rival, he said, and in the second half became something closer to an ally. "What is it?" she said, catching the particular expression that had arrived on his face. Was he not, Gideon asked innocently, a fairly important supporting character in his own right? Who knows? She had only ever read the scenes with Leandro standing in them. Besides, somebody had told her very firmly not to influence this world in any way at all. How merciless, he said. It was not as though she remembered nothing whatsoever. Leandros had taken every sweet part of that novel, and Gideon had been given only labor. That was his punishment, she informed him, for hiding the fact that Leandros still remembered her. If he was that curious about it, she said sweetly, why not pay a price of his own for once? 2 days later, she was up a ladder in the library reaching for the top shelf in a cloud of dust. A brown leather spine came out of the row and the whole aisle went gray around her. "So much dust," she said, and then coughed until her eyes were streaming. She needed all of this cleaned before the summer heat set in properly and the damp came. Then a pair of polished shoes came across the patterned floor somewhere below her. "The humidity rises in summer," said a voice, "and books are damaged extremely easily." Would he pass her the volume by the foot of the ladder, she asked, without thinking about it. He handed the book up, and she realized exactly who she had just given an order to. "That is right," she said suddenly, remembering something entirely unrelated to any of this. She had forgotten to ask the other day. He had replied to that letter after all, had he not? And then her foot went out from under her on the 3rd rung from the top. He crossed the entire floor faster than she could finish falling off the ladder. She landed hard against a chest that was very definitely not the library floorboards. Both her hands had closed on the front of his coat without any instruction from her at all. He had not known, he said, looking down at her, that he possessed a talent for startling people. She lay there in his arms in the middle of the library and could not make herself let go. He looked down at her without any particular expression on his face whatsoever. Was that a habit of hers, he asked, grabbing his chest every single time he caught her. Did she have a habit like that? She genuinely did not know anything about herself anymore. He set her down carefully on her own feet and stepped back one pace. She smoothed her skirt down with hands that had entirely refused to stop shaking. "Thank you," she managed to say, at roughly half of her ordinary speaking volume. She started to leave with the duster still in her hand and got about 4 steps. "Is that all the thanks he gets for it?" he asked her back. "I'm sore. No, thank you. So I'm sorry," she said in one entirely collapsing sentence. He stood there and watched a grown woman short-circuit in front of a bookshelf. Could she really not take a joke, he asked, and she nearly threw the duster at his head. Then he crossed the floor toward her instead of walking out of the room. He leaned down and brushed something off her cheek with the side of one finger. She shut her eyes tight and stopped breathing altogether for several seconds. "Here," he said, and showed her what had been sitting on his fingertip. It was covered in dust, apparently. That was all it was. Simply dust. She had wiped that exact spot on her own face only a moment before he arrived. "Perhaps she should clean the places she could actually reach," he said, instead of climbing ladders. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, to a corridor that he had already walked out of. The gardens outside the house were full of hard green summer light that week. She carried her bucket out through the rose arch the following afternoon at the usual hour. She felt a chill go through her under all that sun. Perhaps she was catching a cold. "Ah, Miss Reeve," called a man from the terrace and waved her over toward the table. She stopped by the brick wall, genuinely surprised to be recognized by anybody at all. He had not been waiting for Lilianchas out here, he said. He had been waiting for her. For her? There had to have been some sort of mistake somewhere in that sentence. He simply wanted, he said, to thank her properly for something she had done. He smiled and put a hand to his ear as though she had spoken far too quietly. Could he have a little of her time? It would not take very long at all. She sat down on a terrace chair beside a pond she had never once bothered to look at. His mistress had held a very clear dream ever since she was a small child, he said. They all knew she was inexperienced, and not one of them could give her a harsh opinion. It was not that they feared hurting her. They feared she might give the dream up entirely. What she needed now was somebody with genuine expert knowledge of the relevant field. So he was asking a maid in a garden to keep saying the thing nobody else would say. She was not a girl of 14, Mireille said. She was a fully grown adult of 24. He should pretend, she told him, that he had never given her any thanks at all today. She had only spoken up because watching it had become far too frustrating to bear. And then something occurred to her, and she went completely still in the terrace chair. It was written somewhere in that novel that Archer had a teenage daughter of his own, and that before joining the trading company, he had run a small souvenir shop for years, which made him the single man in this empire who knew the most about choosing gifts. She sat forward in her chair like somebody who had just been shown an emergency exit. "Yes, of course," he said, entirely unaware of what he had just walked into. "Go ahead." The truth was that she had received a letter from her parents a few weeks ago. She had been carrying it around in a drawer ever since, unanswered and unanswerable. Was there anything he would recommend that might reassure them she was doing well? "Something to send in the place of a letter," he repeated, thinking about it properly. In that case, he said, how would she feel about a teacup set? He had one entirely spare, and neither of them yet knew what that gift would end up costing. She stared at him with both hands raised in horror at the very idea of it. It must be enormously expensive. She could not possibly accept a thing like that from him. A week later, she was sitting at a garden table with a pen and a stack of company ledgers. Until a new person was chosen, would she please act as Lilianchas's advisor? She had never once expected anything remotely like this to happen to a borrowed maid. Lillian pressed a rolled sheet of figures into her hands and beamed at her across the table. She could not, she said, laughing at her. She only knew a very little about any of it. She had dealt with numbers more than enough back in her own world, after all. She was far better suited to this work than she had ever been to laundry or floors. But there was a problem, and the problem was sitting 3 feet away and watching her. 2 men with the same face sat in the roses while she tried to add up a single column. He took the day off every single day. It had been a while since she saw him do any work. He really did do absolutely everything entirely at his own particular pace. But she was relieved at the very least that he looked better than he had last time. He turned a white rose over and over in his fingers in the late morning light. Her stomach had felt strange for a while now, and her head had started to ache badly. A hand came into her field of vision holding the rose out toward the page. That was an unusual calculation method, he said. Where exactly had she learned to do that? This world's mathematics were not the same as hers, and she had just written it all down. She probably had not come from the academy, she said. Probably, he repeated slowly. How on earth was she supposed to know the details of Hazel Reeves' education? She coughed into her hand and hoped very much that it would end the conversation. But she had a cough. Was she genuinely all right? Lillian asked from across the table. Come to think of it, Lillian added, how old was Miss Reeve again exactly? 24, she said, without thinking about it for even one entire second. Lillian seized both of her hands, delighted. The two of them were exactly the same age. That was strange, Silas said. She had said 22 the last time somebody asked her. She opened her mouth and absolutely nothing at all came out of it. Now that she thought about it, she said brightly, 22 did seem rather more correct. A hand came down over her eyes before she could invent anything further than that. He held his palm flat against her forehead in the sunlight and did not move it away. She had a fever, he said. Was she genuinely, honestly all right? The truth was that she had been feeling unwell since somewhere before breakfast. Both of them turned on her at exactly the same moment and started talking at once. She needed to rest immediately, and it would not be deducted from her pay this month. At this point, she could not focus on the ledgers anyway. Her head was throbbing badly. Understood, she said, setting the pen down. She would rest for today after all. A good decision, Silas said. If she collapsed, he was the one who would suffer for it. Then there appeared, very briefly, to be two Lord Silases standing among the roses. My body, she said, and did not finish the sentence. My body feels strange. And the whole garden came up to meet her. Somebody was holding her and stroking her hair in a place that was not that garden. She opened her eyes onto a face she had not seen in a very long time. Are you awake? Her sister asked, smiling down at her the way she used to. Sister, she said. That's right, the voice answered her. The only one in the world, her sister said, and went on stroking her hair. And then the hand closed in it, and the whole room changed temperature at once. So why do you look down on me? Those eyes that look at me as if you understand everything. They make me furious, said the dream, and the floor disappeared out from under her again. A woman standing with her hand over her mouth in the dark of a city street. Don't go, said somebody in that dream, reaching out with both hands. Please don't go. Light came from somewhere behind her and never once reached her face. Someone was running up a concrete stairwell underneath a security camera, and somebody else was lying on a wooden floor and was not moving at all. A single sheet of paper lay near an outstretched hand in the dark of that room. She looked at all of it from somewhere above and could not tell which of them she was. An old book lay open somewhere, its pages full of a story that nobody was reading. Something small and bright drifted down slowly onto black water. And a night sky went on above all of it, indifferent and completely enormous. She woke to sunlight coming through carved wooden slats and a headache like a bell. A week passed and she went back to the studio as though nothing at all had happened. No matter how busy she had been, she could not believe she forgot something that important. She had fainted because a summer cold and her own body had arrived on the very same day. Hazel had considerably less stamina than she had ever thought to account for. She felt as though she had dreamed something while she was lying unconscious in the grass. Somebody had been there with her. She could not remember one single detail of any of it. Silas painted on in the bright room and did not ask her about any of it once. No, she said, when he finally looked over. She was only a little tired today. She should make sure she was eating properly, he said without lifting his eyes. Compared to when they first met, she had gone far too thin. The wind would carry her off. He did draw people for a living, he pointed out to her mildly. How could he possibly fail to notice something as obvious as that? When he smiled that particular way, he looked exactly like Leandros used to. Which was, for reasons she absolutely refused to examine, extremely irritating. Leandros and Hazel Reeve could not remotely be described as close to one another. Those eyes full of contempt turned on her the day she was summoned over his brother. And lately, he kept playing strange little pranks purely to get a reaction out of her. She looked up at him in the lamplight of a corridor and refused to step backward. She had started wanting, very badly indeed, to pinch that handsome nose of his. She was grateful he caught her when she fell. She simply did not understand why he was there. Those eyes of his. Was it because he had already worked out who she actually was? A brush came down onto a table beside a palette he had not touched all morning. Why not, she asked when he announced that he could not paint anything today. Perhaps the weather was too fine, he said. He could not concentrate on anything at all. He got up instead and stood beside her at the tall window looking down. She closed her eyes for a second in the warmth coming off the glass. "They look close, do they not?" he said in a voice she did not recognize. Down in the garden below, Lillian was laughing at something in the full sun. And a man in a black coat with a red stone at his collar was laughing along with her. The distance between those two had shrunk considerably over the last month. "You have got to be kidding me," Silas said. "For that man to make a face like that." Down below, Leandro smiled at something Lillian had said and did not stop. "This is impossible," Silas said, mostly to the window and not to her. "Hazel," he said suddenly, and put a hand flat on her shoulder. "What?" she said, jumping approximately a foot into the air beside him. "There was a caterpillar sitting on her shoulder," he informed her extremely calmly. He was joking. He absolutely had to be joking about this. He had never seen one that large. Was it on the right side or on the left? She grabbed the front of his shirt with both fists and did not let go of it. "Do not move," he said, leaning over her. He would take it off for her. The two of them stood there in a room full of paintings, far too close together. "It did not appear to be poisonous," he reported, holding the thing at arm's length. "By the way," he said, leaning back down toward her again. "Was she wearing perfume?" "No," she said. "Did she smell strange to him?" "No," he said. "She smelled rather nice. More importantly than that." He smiled down at her, and she looked back at him with total confusion. Her hand. She was still holding on to the front of his shirt with both fists. He leaned down further, and she still could not make herself let go of him. It was fine because it was him. She should avoid doing that absolutely anywhere else. Leandros had said something almost identical to her in a library not 2 weeks ago. And he had not been bringing women here lately, had he? What did she take him for? Outside, the light moved across a carved window, and the leaves had begun to turn. A man in white stood watching the house from behind the iron fence that evening. And somewhere else entirely, a man in black with a red dragon at his collar came through fire. Archer held out a lacquered box with a pale blue tea service laid inside it. He had prepared it as a gift for the Duke, and brought 2 of the same thing by mistake. So she was welcome to the spare, he said, as though that settled the entire matter. She had genuinely not expected the thing to be anywhere near that large. She had said it was a gift for her parents, so he had imagined some small brooch. There was no need to pay him. He knew her circumstances, and she should not hold back. "Forget about the money," he said, "and give him the address to send it to instead." "Please send it here," she said, and wrote out the name of a place she had never seen. "So she had grown up beside the sea," he said. "Probably," she answered. She could not even say for certain that the address was Hazel's home at all. She had guessed at it only because a letter had come from a port called Cecil. She had been so distracted by the leads of that novel that she never once thought about Hazel. The girl whose entire body she had been wearing for months without ever asking permission. She stopped in a corridor and looked at her own hands through an iron grill. She was the one controlling this body. She had been from the very first morning. Which meant there was a question she had never once allowed herself to ask out loud. Where exactly was the real Hazel Reeve right now while she wore her face? She walked out into the gardens the next afternoon with the question still sitting in her. The rose walk was full of heat and the smell of grass somebody had just cut. And then she stopped, because there were voices coming from the tea table ahead of her. Lillian was pouring tea for a boy who could not possibly have been more than 12. "Miss," she said, coming closer, "that child is—" Allow her to introduce him. This was Mars, ledger delivery boy for the trading company. "Hello," she said, to a child with his mouth entirely full of somebody else's cake. She had bought these on her way back from town, Lillian said, pushing the plate across. A hand reached out toward a tray of very small golden tarts. And Mireille experienced something not far short of a religious event. Ever since she arrived, it had been lukewarm soup and hard bread every single day. She had genuinely forgotten what sugar tasted like when somebody had bothered with it. She was glad it suited her, Lillian said, watching her eat with completely open delight. "By the way," Mire said, with her mouth still half full of it, "those flowers." Lillian gathered the yellow roses up against her chest and went slightly pink about it. His Grace had given her the donuts as well, she added, apparently by the crateful. So the two of them had gone out together. Yes, Lillian said. Yes, they had. This was a good sign. This was, at very long last, the original story doing what it should. Lillian smiling like that because of Leandros meant everything was finally back on course. And then Lillian set her cup down and leaned forward with a particular expression. "Miss Reeve," she said, in a voice that had gone extremely conspiratorial. "Were she and Lord Silas romantically involved with one another?" Lillian asked. The delivery boy went on eating without the faintest interest in adult problems. "What?" she said. "What did she mean by that? What exactly was that just now?" "She and Silas, romantically involved." The words refused to arrange themselves properly. Why on earth would anybody in this house think a thing like that? No matter how anyone looked at it, they were employer and servant. It was impossible. Lillian clapped both of her hands over her mouth and looked genuinely stricken. The delivery boy chewed steadily on and said nothing at all. "Actually," Lillian said from behind both of her hands, she had seen the two of them yesterday in Lord Silas's studio, through the window. She had been walking with the Duke, telling him how kind Miss Reeve had been to her lately. And both of them had looked up at a lit window at exactly the wrong possible moment. A man in white had been watching that house from beyond the iron fence that evening, too. From the courtyard, it had looked precisely like a man cupping a woman's face in his hand. And His Grace had said the two of them did not seem to have an ordinary relationship. "That is absolutely not true," Mire said, loudly enough to put a bird off the wall. How could anybody misunderstand a thing in such a spectacularly ridiculous way? "Please calm down," said Lillian, in the voice of a woman regretting her own question. Besides, she had somebody she loved. She and Lord Silas were nothing of the kind. In fact, she was certain Silas would be extremely uncomfortable with the whole idea. And then she remembered exactly who she had just said all of that in front of. Lillian took both her hands across the table with a light coming on behind her eyes. The one trait the original author had given Lilianchus Eden above every other. Mire closed her eyes and quietly accepted her fate at that garden table. Was it true she had somebody she loved? Excessively meddlesome about other people's romances? She was, she understood, in a very great deal of trouble indeed. It took her the better part of an hour to escape up the marble stairs. Just a little more, please. Blondie, she could not say another word about it. She leaned against the wall of the upper corridor and finally breathed out properly. And then she looked up, and Leandros was standing at the top of the stairs. The room behind him was the Duchess's bedroom, which nobody in that house ever entered. "My mother died on the day I turned 8. A boy had said that in a small apartment once. Did he still miss her after 22 years of not being permitted to say so?" She stopped with her hand on the banister and looked up at him from the landing. He came down 2 steps and stopped, and the corridor went very quiet around them. "Did you kiss that man?" he asked. His Grace had seen it as well. Of course, Leandros had misunderstood it too. He had been taking an insect off her clothes. She had never once held Silas's hand. "I see," he said, and did not sound remotely satisfied by any part of it. She started to go past him on the stairs with her heart going far too fast. He asked whether she had heard the rumor that this house's master lost his mind at 20. And fell in love with a woman he had met inside a dream and never recovered from it. So, he said, looking directly down at her, was there anything she wanted to say to him? She stood on those stairs and every possible answer went out of her head at once. Her hand closed hard in the fabric of her own apron and stayed there. She had never heard, she said, any rumor of that particular kind. Well, she was still new here, he said. It made sense this was the first time. But she was not to forget the warning he had already given her once before. And then he went up the stairs past her, already certain of something he would not say yet. He had been probing her. He had not been speaking from any certainty at all. It was all right, she told herself, with her eyes stinging badly on the landing. Below her, he stopped once at the foot of the stairs and looked back up. And then the light in the corridor went out behind him, and he was gone. That night, the window of his room stood open onto a wide blue dark. He stood in front of it in his shirt sleeves with a glass in one hand, and did not drink a single mouthful of it for a very long time. A woman asleep against his shoulder on a floor in another world entirely. Why, he thought, why does she... Brown hair and a face that was not hers, and everything underneath exactly the same. Two people walking a shoreline at night, 10 years and one whole world ago. She had stepped into the water and complained loudly about her shoes. And he had caught her from behind before she could go over into it. "Why do I see you in her?" he said, to a room that contained absolutely nobody. A maid straightening his collar in a mirror without thinking about it at all. A woman putting a hand on his shoulder in a clothing shop full of strangers. Two entirely different faces doing exactly the same thing, 10 years apart. A bottle stood untouched on the table beside him and stayed there all night. He looked out at a sky he had spent a decade searching under for one person. His hand closed and he pressed it hard against both of his eyes. Did he miss her so badly that his mind had begun manufacturing her out of strangers? A man sitting on a floor watching a woman cry into her own hands. She had held a tissue to her eyes and told him it was nothing at all. But that face was the problem, and it always had been. Somewhere very far away, a white sky sat down flat on a blue sea. He stood at the window until the whole room began to get light around him. And then he closed his eyes and did not sleep for a single minute of it. Outside, the willow flowers had come out along the wall during the night. 2 days later, she was polishing library glass until both her arms ached. "Finally," she said, and let out a breath she had been holding for an hour. She was done. She could actually go and rest for once in her life. Then a pair of shoes came across the tiles somewhere behind her. She turned around with the cloth still hanging from one hand. What was he doing here at this hour? She had been about to go to her room. He pulled a folded sheet of paper out of his coat without answering any of that. "This is," she said, and then stopped, because she recognized the seal on it. A letter from his friend. The man had reached the Levantine Empire earlier than expected. If Leandros granted permission, he would come to this manor within 10 days. So the two of them, Gideon said, would very likely be saying goodbye fairly soon. "Mireille," he said, and reached a hand out toward her and stopped it halfway. "You are right," she said, and smiled at him and thanked him for telling her. She had forgotten she was in charge of tonight's rounds. She picked up the lamp. She would excuse herself first then, and she went out extremely quickly. Gideon stood alone in that library and said her name once to absolutely nobody. The corridors of the manor at night were blue and enormous and completely empty. She carried the lamp from room to room the way Hazel had done for 3 years. And then the light found a yellow vase standing on a stand beside a window. The gift Lillian had carried down to Leandros, still tied with its ribbon. He had not put it in a storeroom. He had put it where he would pass it every day. She stood in the dark and smiled at it and felt something go straight through her chest. A woman in a garden holding yellow roses, absolutely glowing with it. "But one day you will disappear from here." Gideon's voice from a library in summer, so do not make him suffer the same thing twice, if she truly cared about him at all. She touched one of the flowers very lightly with the back of one finger. This was a good thing. This was exactly the thing she had been working toward. So she would ask Gideon's friend for help and go back to her own world where she belonged. And then something screamed, somewhere much further down the corridor. That direction was Leandros' bedroom, and there was nothing else along it. She ran with the lamp swinging and her shadow going wild across the walls, and stopped absolutely dead in the doorway of his room. Liliantius Eden was standing inside the Duke's bedroom in the middle of the night. "It is not what it looks like," Lillian said immediately, both hands up. "No, please do not misunderstand this." Mireille had not said one word yet. On her way back to her own room, she had heard a strange sound coming from his. So she had come inside because she was worried something had happened to him. It had sounded, Lillian said, exactly like somebody being strangled. And every single part of Mireille went cold all at once. He, she thought, standing in a doorway with a lamp in her hand. A boy of about 10 sitting at a rainy window, unable to sleep, in a house full of rules. When he was 8 years old, he saw his mother hanging from the ceiling. A child in a doorway with all the light behind him and one shape above his head. Could it be? Was his Grace in there right now, seeing that again? "Please calm down," Lillian said, catching her hard by the arm before she could go in. A hand landed on her shoulder and she realized she had already started forward. Lillian looked back at the closed door and lowered her voice almost to nothing. Because of the sleeping medicine, he had not woken even when she came into the room. It had looked as though he was desperately searching for somebody inside the dream. "The Duchess," Mireille said. "No," Lillian answered. "No, it was not his mother. His Grace had been searching over and over for a woman he called Big Sister. Her hand closed hard around her own wrist, and she could not feel any of it. Lillian looked at her face for a moment and then very quietly went away down the corridor. A hand came to rest against the frame of a door that was still slightly open. Even if she chased after Lillian now, there was nothing she could possibly say to her. Anything she said would only be one more way of lying to a woman who deserved better. She stood outside a closed door in a corridor full of cold blue light. "I am sorry, Lillian," she thought, and put her hand down on the handle. Just once, for the very last time, she went in with the lamp and shut the door quietly behind her. "Please let me be selfish," she said, to nobody in that room who could hear it. The lamp went down on the table beside the bed and threw everything into gold. She sat on the edge of the mattress of a man who had searched 10 years for her. "Big sister," he said, from inside the dream, "please forget about me already." She reached out and touched his hair, exactly the way she had that first night. Because you are trapped in the past, she thought, the story cannot move forward at all. "Don't go," he said without waking, and turned his face into the palm of her hand. "You absolute idiot. A duke who could not forget a woman he had known for 10 days. And on top of everything else, calling her name out loud in his sleep like this." She sat there in the blue dark for a long time and did not let go of him. And then she leaned down and held him the way she had not been allowed to in years. "Good night," she said into his hair. His breathing evened out under her hands for the first time in a very long while. "Let tonight be the last night you ever have to dream about me." The doors swung shut behind her on a corridor with nobody at all in it. And in the room she had just left, a man sat straight up in bed, wide awake, having heard all of it. He put both hands over his face and stayed exactly like that for a long moment. Then he turned his head toward the door that had just closed behind her, and did not follow her because he no longer trusted a single thing he felt. Outside, the first cold night of the season came down over the whole estate. 2 days later, at dawn, Leandros left for the capital exactly as scheduled. While he was away, Gideon would handle the family's affairs as acting duke. And Silas, for reasons nobody would explain to her, shut himself in his bedroom entirely. She sat under the big tree at the edge of the grounds with nothing at all to do. One man locked in a bedroom, one locked in an office. It felt like another world again. She glared at the mountains as though they had personally arranged all of it. Or rather, to be accurate about it, she had simply returned to her actual life. She had left home the moment she became an adult and been alone the entire time since. It was only after Leandros fell into it that anything in that life had ever got loud. And it was only in this world that she had ever been anything other than quiet. Then a small voice said her borrowed name, and Mars was standing there with the horse. A tall, rich, blonde man had told him to give this to her, he announced proudly. A tall, rich, blonde man. There were exactly 2 of those in this entire house. She took the carved wooden box out of his hands extremely carefully. Tall, handsome. Did he mean his Grace? He could not call him that, apparently. If the servants heard a delivery boy talk like that, he would be scolded for a week. But the man had said it was fine. He had said that once this was handed over, "Leandros," she said out loud. Leandros had sent this all the way back to her. "Yes," said Mars cheerfully, and his errand being done, he excused himself and went. She sat down in the long grass with the box held in both of her hands. It smelled faintly sweet. Had somebody genuinely put perfume on a wooden box? She got the lid open with both thumbs and looked down into it. And then she stopped breathing entirely for several seconds. Lilac. A bundle of cut lilac, laid carefully beside one small white book. She lifted a single sprig of it out into the sunlight and stared at the thing. "Why," she said, "why on earth would he send her this?" Far away, a carriage was crossing a whole field of the same flower under an enormous sky. And a man stood at the window of an inn along the road looking out at all of it. Was it because of the accident 10 years ago? He seemed more displeased than usual today. Thanatos watched the Duke stretched out along the carriage seat and said nothing for a while. He had to finish his schedule in the capital and return as fast as it could possibly be done. He could not stop worrying, he said, about what he had left behind him at the manor. 3 days later, the sky over the estate was scrubbed clean and completely enormous. A black carriage stood in the courtyard, and the entire household had come out to it. The master of the house had come home considerably earlier than anybody had expected. Trunks came down off the roof, and the quiet ducal house became very loud again. A pigeon went up off the gravel somewhere in the garden, and nobody noticed it. Everyone seemed busy since the master returned. Was she all right being out here? She could go if she liked. Sketching was boring anyway, Silas said, without looking up. A red pencil moved steadily across the paper and did not stop for anything. He had been shut inside his room for days on end, and she had not forgotten it. Had something happened to him? Not really. He had simply had more drawing to do. Even so, she said, there was no need for a grown man to seal himself into a bedroom. He only ever said that when it suited him. He was a slacker, and they both knew it. She had grown quite arrogant lately, he observed, entirely delighted about the change. A petal came down through the air and landed neatly in her open hand. She stood there looking at one small purple flower lying in her palm. Lord Silas, she said, did he happen to know anything at all about flowers? He had studied herbology at the academy, he said, for whatever that was worth now. Well, she said, she had received lilacs and had no idea what to make of them. She had absolutely no idea what a bundle of them was supposed to mean. He turned around and looked at her properly for the first time that afternoon. What kind of man was he exactly, the one who sent them? That is, she said, and there seemed to be a bit of an age gap between the two of them. Conveying feelings through flower language was rather old-fashioned, he said. What did lilacs mean then, she asked. First love, he told her. That is the language of lilac. And he smiled at her over the top of the page. First love. She stood absolutely still in a garden with a pencil in one hand. He watched her work the whole thing out and gave her all the time she needed for it. Then he cleared his throat, looked out at the trees, and did not look back at her. Yes, she said when he finally called her name. She turned around with her whole face already braced for something enormous. He had mentioned a piece he had been working on lately, had he not? He said, which was not remotely like him in any way at all. Why was the man being quite so dramatic about a single ordinary sentence? It was a drawing of her, he said. That was the piece he had been working on. What did he mean by that? You know, he said. That one, the one from before. The portrait he had painted in the studio on the night that it rained. He still had it? She had asked a dozen times, and he played dumb every single time. She had been completely certain that he burned it along with all the rest of them. He had kept it as a surprise, he said. It was a drawing of her, after all. Where was it now, she asked. Was it still somewhere in his bedroom? He stored his favorite pieces, he said, in his mother's old room upstairs. You have heard the rumor that the master of this estate lost his mind at 20. So do you have anything at all that you want to tell me? Everything inside her went white, and then it went very, very cold. That question on the stairs had not been suspicion at all. He had already seen the painting. Come to think of it, Silas said, there was something he had meant to mention. A garden chair went over onto the tiles behind her with a crash. She was already running, and she did not hear the end of his sentence. Hazel, he shouted after her with one hand still held out toward the path. Where are you going? He called, to a corridor she had already disappeared into. The Duchess's bedroom stood open at the far end of the upper hall. A man in a black coat was standing in front of an easel inside it. She stopped in the doorway with all the light coming past her into the room. She could not get enough air into her chest to say anything at all. He did not turn around, and he did not seem remotely surprised that she had come. A new maid joined the household, he said. At first, she genuinely got on his nerves. And then, from a certain day onward, he had begun to feel something like nostalgia. In her expressions, in small gestures nobody alive would ever think to copy. She stood in that doorway and could not make herself move one step closer to him. And the woman he could only ever meet inside a dream was standing in that painting. I am begging you, he said without turning. Please do not deny it this time. Her hands twisted in her apron and her whole face had started to come apart. She could not say it. A few more days and Gideon's friend would arrive and end all of it. It was her fault that a cross had been carved into that chest in the first place. She had no right whatsoever to stand in the way of that man's happiness now. Leandros would be with Lillian, exactly as the book said. She only wanted a goodbye. Because that day at the beach they were torn apart with no warning and no last word. Anything is fine, he said, still facing the painting. Please just say something to me. Sister, he said. And the word went through 10 years and a broken window and one entire other world. Sister, she repeated, and her voice came apart somewhere in the middle of it. What are you talking about? She said, walking toward him. What are you saying to me? He turned around at last, and she was already there in front of him. You are the older one now, she told him. You have been for a very long time. And then she had both arms around him, and neither of them could breathe properly. He held on to her the way a man holds something that has been taken away before. The light through the window went slowly across both of them at once. "I have missed you," he said into her hair. "My beloved, I have missed you so much." "I missed you too," she said, and her hands closed hard on both of his shoulders. He had wanted to see her, he said, for so long, for so completely unbearably long. And in a room full of paintings of one woman, the two of them finally stopped pretending. On sunny days, he used to come in here and simply look at them, Silas had told her once. Doing that made it feel as though nothing had ever happened in that particular room. So he had gone into his mother's bedroom that day as well, exactly as always, and a portrait of a woman with thick black hair stood on a stand against the far wall. He had stood in front of it for a very long time without moving at all. That was when he found her, he said, in a painting in his dead mother's room. He put a hand against her cheek and she let him, and neither of them spoke. His fingers closed around her wrist as though he were checking that it was solid. She laughed at him then, very wetly, and after a moment he laughed as well. She had thought, she said, that he had simply been missing his mother. Had it not hurt her, he asked, when he lied to her on those stairs that night? None of that matters now, she said, and meant every word of it. The afternoon light came in gold across both of them, and neither moved out of it. "The only thing that matters," he said, "is that I am standing here with you, big sister." She stood there entirely dazed in a borrowed body and let him say all of it. "More importantly," he said, "what exactly is going on with that body of yours?" She had gained a few freckles since the last time they saw each other, apparently. "This world," he repeated. "Possessed." He said both of the words as though testing them. In her world, she told him, this entire place was nothing more than a romance novel. She had found it in a library a week after he vanished off a beach without a word. If it was a romance novel, he said slowly, was there a heroine he was meant to end with? Yes, she said. There was, and there always had been, right from the first page. And she closed her eyes rather than watch his face while she said the name out loud. The name went off in the middle of that quiet room like something detonating in a well. "Liliansha's Eden," she said. "That is the heroine of this story and always was." "Her," he repeated in a voice with nothing at all behind it. He was destined to be with Lillian. That was how the book ended, and books do not change. Gideon's friend was arriving soon. Once she went home, Leandros would be alone again. So why on earth had she just gone and told him exactly who she actually was? She had to tell him the rest of the truth, all of it, before she lost the nerve entirely. "Listen," she said, "actually there is something else you need to—" And he pulled her into him hard enough to knock the whole sentence out of her. "My only heroine," he said into the top of her head, "is you." He took her hand and would not let her step back out of reach of him again. Both now and 10 years ago, and every single day in between the two. She still did not comprehend, he said, the depth of what he actually felt for her. Her 1 week, she told him, had been every bit as deep as his 10 years. And it seemed she was never going to be able to get out from under it either. They looked at each other from about 4 inches apart, and neither of them moved. That short week they had spent together in a tiny apartment in another world. And then he leaned down, and neither of them said anything at all for a while. Two people under a sky full of stars that only one of them had ever really stood beneath. The next morning she dressed him for the day as though absolutely nothing had happened. He turned away into the light with his coat folded over one arm. "This is unbelievably awkward," she said to the empty corridor afterward. She had to look up an extremely long way just to fasten his collar properly. A memory of the previous night arrived uninvited, and she nearly dropped the necktie. "Focus," she told herself severely. She was on the clock. She was at work right now. He looked down at her with an expression that was not helping her situation. Their fingers touched over a button, and she jumped as though she had been shocked. A footman stood beside the door, pretending very hard indeed to be a piece of furniture. Why was he undoing his own buttons? This way he got to look at her face a little longer. What on earth was he, she said, and got absolutely no further than that. "That hairstyle," he said, watching her hands. "It suits you." He leaned in past her shoulder to reach for something and stayed there a moment too long. And smiled at her in a way that was frankly unfair coming from a man of 30. Outside, the sky over the estate was very blue and completely unhelpful about all of it. She hid in the library at midday and put her forehead flat against a bookshelf. "That hairstyle suits you." How could a grown man say that with an entirely straight face? "My only heroine is you." He had said that as well. He had actually said that out loud. "Calm down," she told herself, holding onto a shelf with both hands. "Seriously, Calm down. Ah, she said, straightening up very fast indeed. Gideon. He had been standing in that aisle for some considerable time already. There was no need to explain any of it. Leandros had already shown him everything. He never thought this would be the reason he touched that boy for the first time in 10 years. She stood behind him and had absolutely no idea where to begin apologizing. Are you disappointed in me? She asked him. He expected nothing from anybody at all, he said, so he had no reason to be disappointed. But he would very much like her to tell him one single thing before she went. Are you Mireille or are you Hazel? Which one of the two is standing in front of him? Her hand closed hard enough to leave marks in the middle of her own palm. She looked up at him in a library full of books that had all been written by somebody. Even if she did end up going home, she said, she would persuade him to live a normal life. He walked away between the shelves without answering that immediately. I truly hope that happens, he said from the far end of the room. And that same morning, a carriage came up the forest road toward the estate. It had been quite a while, said the passenger, since he last saw the skies of Etosina. 20 years? No, considerably longer. He wondered if the pipsqueak had grown at all. The manor stood lit against the mountains that night like something out of an illustration. She went up the stairs with her hand on the rail and her heart going very hard. Are you Mireille or Hazel? Which one are you? She still had no answer at all for it. A pair of shoes crossed a polished floor somewhere in the dark above her. Leandros, she said quietly from the doorway of the upstairs sitting room. He was on the sofa with his eyes closed and had not moved at all when she came in. She leaned down to look at him properly, and he opened one eye and smiled at her. So he had been wide awake the entire time after all, the absolute menace. He caught her by the arm and pulled her down onto the sofa beside him. Hey, big sister, he said. Did you not miss me even a little? He had a very hard time, he said, holding back how badly he wanted to see her. She went scarlet from the collar of her dress all the way upward. That had scared her half to death, she said. Had he been asleep or not? A bit of both. He had been dozing until he heard her footsteps out in the corridor. She looked away, entirely undone by the fact that a man recognized the way she walked. A bottle of red wine stood unopened on the low table beside the two of them. Do not worry about it, he said. He had not touched a single drop of it tonight. Every second was precious now. He could not afford to fall asleep by accident. She smiled down at her own hands in her lap and could not make herself stop. Leandros, she said, and every trace of the smile went out of her at once. He pulled his coat off his shoulders before she could start the sentence. She was dressed far too lightly, he said, and put the whole thing around her. It was the middle of summer. She was not the slightest bit cold. This was not her world, he said quietly. She might catch something here. She cleared her throat, and he covered an entire laugh with one hand. Actually, she said, she had wanted to talk to him. What a coincidence, he answered. Was it her from the very beginning? From the day she was first hired into this house? She looked up at him and found he was watching her far too closely for comfort. To be exact, he said, it was from the day she walked straight into him in a corridor. Because after that day, she had suddenly been entrusted with all sorts of work. And then he had called her into that room and said an unforgivable thing to her face. He had been genuinely out of his mind back then. She had not known who she was either. He put a hand over his eyes at the memory of his own sentence and left it there. It did not bother her anymore, she told him, and she actually meant it. And then he went down onto one knee on the carpet directly in front of her. Leandros, she said, half rising off the sofa in alarm. As a knight, he said, he was formally apologizing. He ought to be holding his sword. He was truly and completely sorry for having hurt her the way that he did. She looked down at the top of his head and could not speak for a long moment. Protecting the family was his duty. It had been the only correct thing for him to do. He had no idea, he said, how ashamed of it he was. And then she said his name. She wanted him to keep living his life exactly like that. What did she mean by that? She smiled at him in front of a tall window absolutely full of stars. Because she would be leaving this place fairly soon, she said. He had heard Gideon's guest was coming. That guest was coming specifically for her. To find out when and how she could go back. And his hand closed hard on her shoulder. Why, he said. Was it because of the hurtful things he had said to her that day? No, she said. It was only everything going back to the way it was supposed to be. The next morning, the two of them stood together at the door of his rooms. She straightened his necktie without being asked, the way she did every single day now. Just like how you left me." He had not stopped hearing it since she walked out. The door had closed behind her, and he had stood there for a very long time afterward. He should not have let her go back to her own room like that, and he knew it. He looked out at a green morning that did not have any answers in it either. Yesterday, he thought, and could not make himself finish the thought properly. If a guest was coming, she should have told him herself instead of sending somebody else. Princess Cassandra was coming. Why did he have to hear a thing like that from somebody else? Silas stood in the middle of the room with one hand pressed flat against his own chest. Princess Cassandra. She had been so busy she forgot it was about time for that. From now on, Leandro said, he should put some clothes on inside this house. Try it again and see what happens. Was he drunk this early in the morning? Why on earth were the two of them fighting again before breakfast? Silas winced, put a hand to his head, and called it the worst possible start to a day. "Are you done playing dress-up?" he asked her, once his brother had gone downstairs. If she was done, they should go. He was always strange, but today he was worse. She followed him out through a hall full of gold leaf and chandeliers. And then she stopped, because something about the way he was walking was wrong. She caught his wrist before he could light anything and told him to stop smoking. And then something dark landed in the middle of her open palm. She looked down at it and her eyes went extremely wide. "His nose," she said, reaching up toward his face. "His nose is—" He looked at the blood on his own fingers as though it belonged to somebody else. And then his entire weight came down onto her shoulder at once. He had felt a little dizzy, he said. Could he stay like this for a moment? She put a hand to his forehead and found a fever hot enough to genuinely frighten her. She held him up in the corridor with the morning sun coming through the glass behind them. He slept through the entire afternoon in a room full of warm yellow light. He should rest for a while, Gideon said. And please make sure that he takes the medicine. And do not bother calling a doctor, said the patient, from underneath the blanket. She let out a breath that could have knocked over a candle at 10 paces. He did not want to seem dramatic, he said, over what was obviously a simple cold. Gideon looked down at her and said absolutely nothing about any of it. Was it really just a cold? She had never seen anybody get a nosebleed from one before. He had always been prone to them. As a child, sneezing had been quite enough. See, he said, and smiled at her from the pillow like a man proving a point. He would inform his Grace about this. There was really no need to go out of his way. His brother would not care if he died in a ditch. Gideon said he would tell him anyway. Silas made a noise of pure contempt directly into his own blanket. Gideon smiled at absolutely nobody in particular and let himself out of the room. She stayed exactly where she was with a damp cloth in both of her hands. He turned his face away toward the wall and did not say anything for a while. What was wrong with him now? Did he want to talk about his brother? Where was she looking? He demanded. Would she please take this seriously? His nose was not over there. She apologized sincerely to a man with a nosebleed. Whatever. She should go and rest as well. His nose had stopped bleeding anyway. And change her clothes. Somebody sitting beside him would not make him heal any faster. She did not move a single inch from the chair beside his bed. A man lying on his side somewhere else entirely, breathing badly, in a blue room. 2 nurses in pale uniforms holding a woman down onto a hospital bed. A face she knew very well, twisted up with something that was not quite pain. An empty corridor with 1 chair in it and a window absolutely full of night. She had sat inside that building once, and what happened there she had never told a living soul. And she sat down on the sofa beside the bed and folded her hands in her lap. It is lonely, she said, being ill all by yourself with nobody in the room. Suit yourself, he said again, in a completely different voice from before. She smiled up at the ceiling of a room that she was going to have to leave. A white bowl sat on the carved table beside a lamp that had burned all night. He slept on, and for once his face was not doing anything complicated at all. She put the back of her hand to his forehead. The fever had come down a little. Like this, he was the exact image of a 20-year-old Leandros on an apartment floor. And then she saw the scar, a small starred mark just below his hairline. He put a hand over his face, and she realized he had been awake for some time. What? He said. She was still here? She had meant to leave once the fever broke. He was better, he said. Now that she mentioned it, he really was much better. Why was she staring at him like that? Well, he had a scar on his forehead. Ah, he said, and pushed his hair back off it with one hand. This one, it was a scar, he said, that his own mother had given him. Her whole face changed at that, and he lay there and watched it happen. There was no why to it, he said. She had simply hated her own sons, both of them. Their mother hated them from the beginning, and cursed the fact she had borne twins. Two small boys with armfuls of flowers, holding them out to a woman who stepped back. "Get away from me," she had told them. "The pair of you are creeping me out." Being connected by blood, he said, was surprisingly terrifying when you thought about it. She stood up out of the chair and went across to the basin by the window. "She knew that," she said, wringing out the cloth. She knew it far too well herself. "Please do not tell anybody else what he had just told her," he said. Was she planning to keep his special treatment all to herself? How incredibly greedy. She simply did not want anybody in this house to see Lord Silas as weak. He looked at her sideways for a very long moment and said nothing at all. That was right. She was going to have to say a proper goodbye to Silas, too. Her whole body felt sluggish. She had been avoiding this conversation for 3 days. She was planning, she said, on leaving her position here fairly soon. His hand closed around her arm hard enough to actually hurt her. Why? Was the work too hard? Not at all. It was family circumstances at home. He did not know whether he could help, but she should tell him about it first. "Just talking about it is fine," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. She looked at him and understood this was going to be far worse than she had planned. His hand came down over hers on top of the blanket and stayed there. He took back what he said about her leaving. She would stay until he was better. She had other duties in this house. Staying beside him all day was a little... And his condition, he added, was getting considerably worse because of her. She went out to walk the grounds that evening with her thoughts scattered everywhere. She had wanted to see the estate before she left, and now had no idea where to start. Just talking about it is fine. She could still hear the exact way he had said it. That was the first time she had ever heard Silas raise his voice at anybody. She wondered whether Leandros felt the same way. Felt the same way about what? She spun around fast enough to very nearly go straight over into the flower bed. A pair of shoes came to a stop on the gravel path directly behind her. And then she was against a chest she recognized, under a sky going purple at the edges. She was so reckless, he said, that there was no possible way he could let her go. They had already finished talking about that, she said. No, he said. They had not. The last of the daylight went along the garden wall beside the two of them. Yesterday she had been the only one talking, he said. So today, he wanted her to listen to him instead. Did she have any time after this? And if she did not, then he would simply make some time for her himself. Drink this, he said, pushing a cup across the table. He had heard it was good for sleep. They sat together in a warm room with a low fire and absolutely nobody else in it. Why exactly was she staring at him like that, he asked. She very nearly dropped the cup and told him it was nothing at all. He wanted him to cut back on the drinking, did he not? He would listen very carefully. It smelled good, she admitted, and drank about half of it in one go. He had nothing specific he wanted to talk about, he said after a while. He simply wanted to be with her a little longer. That was why he asked for the time. They had not once had the chance to sit down together since any of this began. By the way, he said, how exactly was his brother getting on? His fever had come down that morning, she reported. Good grief, he said. That idiot. And both of them laughed at the same moment. She sat back on the sofa with the cup warming both of her hands. And then she put it down, because she had come in here to say something. She was not telling him to marry Lilianchus. She wanted him to meet a woman he loved. To build a warm family and be happy, even after she had gone back to her own world. I cannot do that, he said. The only person he wanted to build a warm family with was her, and nobody else alive. Her hands closed around the cup and absolutely refused to let go of it. He needed to think about reality. Even Silas had no children. What about an heir? If it came to that, he had been planning to adopt a relative's nephew anyway. That family was tangled in an inheritance dispute, and the boy could not inherit otherwise. Things would change if his brother married and had a child, of course they would. Nobody in that house believed Silas would settle down, not even Gideon believed it. So there was no need whatsoever for her to sit here worrying about an heir. He simply wanted her to think about him and about nothing else at all. Could she do that for him? She made a noise like a kettle and put both of her hands over her own face. Idiot, she said. Marriage was not supposed to be this enormous an ordeal for anybody. She felt as though she was going completely out of her mind because of him. He was honored to hear it, he said. He felt exactly the same way about her. And then his voice changed completely, and she stopped laughing at once. He had been going to try and stop her leaving, he said. He had planned to beg her, but he could not bear to look at her sad face any longer than he already had. What she was actually afraid of was disappearing suddenly, was it not? Exactly as he had, off a beach in the middle of a sentence without one word of warning. Her hand closed hard in the front of her own apron and stayed there. After he vanished in that small room with no trace of his warmth left anywhere in it, she could not count the tears. It had felt like a hole torn straight through her chest. He listened to every word of it without once looking away from her face. He had told her, had he not, if he had only kept hold of her hand that day. He kept thinking there was a version of that night in which they were never separated. He had regretted it every single day for 10 entire years. He never wanted to go through that particular kind of pain again in his life. He did not know how much time was left. He wanted to fill every hour of it with her. She looked up at him with her eyes full and did not trust her own voice at all. He was planning to commission a painting of them at her sea, a place he could never actually reach. Her hands closed together in her lap and would not come apart again. Yes, she said, let's do exactly that. Then, he said, let him give her a proper welcome home first. She informed him very loudly that this body currently belonged to somebody else. They were both in their 30s now, he said, and she was still absurdly innocent. That was only him. She was still 23 years old, thank you very much. She had already told him. He had become the older one, and not her. What exactly did she mean by a thing like that? When she arrived in this world, he had aged by 10 years, and she had not aged at all. The whole room went very quiet around the end of that sentence. I'm sorry, he said. It was fine. There was no possible way he could have known their ages had reversed. More importantly, she said, straightening up, she had a favor to ask him. Anything at all, except marrying another woman, which remained out of the question. Lend me some money, she said. He looked at her the way a man looks at a sentence he is certain he has misheard. Had she been gambling with his brother again? No, she said, with both of her eyes firmly shut. Or perhaps her family back home was in some kind of trouble? Then why on earth did she need a sum of money immediately? Actually, she said, twisting her fingers together in her lap, Gideon's friend was a prophet who dealt with kings and men who owned entire fleets. He might demand payment for the information, and she was completely without a coin. He knew of the man, too. His father had invited him to this estate once, years ago. He doubted money was what the prophet wanted. He would ask for something far rarer. And then he asked, very quietly, exactly when she was planning to return to her world. She looked at him and found she had absolutely no answer for that either. A hand came down on the gilded handle of the drawing room door the next morning. She straightened her collar and made herself smile properly before she went in. The doors opened onto a room full of light with 3 men already waiting inside it, and a boy of about 12 with white hair, holding a staff with a blue stone in it. Had he not told them there was no need to send anybody down, said the boy. Gideon sat beside him on the sofa, looking exactly like a scolded schoolboy. Outlander, said the prophet, sit down next to the Duke. Yes, she said. She looked at the ceiling and reminded herself this was a 300-year-old man. 4 people arranged themselves around a tea table with a very great deal of care. Had she run here? She could have taken her time. She had rushed to finish her work. For a visitor from another world, said the boy, she was remarkably ordinary to look at. Since Gideon made such a fuss, he had half expected her to have a tail at least. Who made a fuss? His emotions had been bleeding through the letter, apparently. Was it the hair color? The 2 of them looked like brothers born decades apart. His name, he announced to the room, was Amon. He was exhausted from the journey and wanted this finished so that he could rest. She sat forward on the sofa with her whole face lighting up at once, and pulled a battered little purse out of the pocket of her apron. Actually, she said, she had prepared a few questions of her own for him. She did not exactly have money to spare, but had she carried that around every day? Even so, if she ever met Mr. Amon, there was something she truly wanted to ask. The staff came up and pointed at her, and she went straight behind her own arms. How impudent, Mr. Amon? He had lived 300 years longer than she had. Grandfather or elder, and absolutely nothing else, thank you very much. She started to apologize, and Leandro started to object at exactly the same moment. Keep quiet, boy, said the prophet, to a 30-year-old Duke of the Empire. He was quite strict about how he was addressed, Gideon offered rather helpfully. Considering the man's age, she thought the title was arguably completely correct. What he wanted was not money. He wanted something considerably more valuable than that. Something that a character inside a book could not possibly ever know for himself. In short, the truth. She apologized and said she did not remember every single detail. It did not matter. He only needed to know whether his own prophecies were correct. Would Emperor Belos live long enough to see the new year? How was she supposed to answer that? Should she be glad she knew it at all? Even if he survived this year, his condition would worsen sharply from next spring. But even the novel had never given the exact hour of His Majesty's death. The novel had ended before that point, so that was why they were rushing his marriage. That is sufficient, said the prophet, and smiled like something that had eaten very well. He settled back into the sofa and looked at her over the top of his own staff. Now it was her turn, he said. What exactly did she wish to know? She swallowed hard enough that everybody in the room could hear it. First, she wanted to know whether the world she came from was still in the same century. She sat forward on the very edge of the seat with both hands folded in her lap. Understood, he said, and reached for something inside the front of his coat. Give me your blood. A maid came in through the door at that exact moment carrying a tea tray. Ah, said the prophet without looking up. Right on time. The maid set the pot down and left again as fast as dignity would allow her. He poured out a cup of tea in front of 4 people and nobody moved to stop him. Your hand, he said, and held his own out flat across the table toward her. She gave it to him and looked determinedly at the ceiling instead. 3 drops went down into a black and gold teacup and sat there. He stirred it once with a spoon and the entire room leaned in toward it. The liquid went red and then began very faintly to steam. He did not know what a 21st century was supposed to be, he said. But not 1 full year had passed in that place since she left it. Her hand closed around Leandros's wrist without any decision from her at all, and his hand closed around hers just as hard, and neither of them let go. He smiled down at her, and she smiled back with her eyes absolutely streaming. Then she said, wiping her face, for her second question, when exactly could she return to her original world? She looked up at him with the smile still sitting half-finished on her face. Give up, he said. Give up. The 2 words sat in the middle of that gilded room and did not move. She said. The vessel for her soul had already burned and vanished. How did she intend to return? Had she not come here, he asked, because she died over there in the first place? He had assumed even an outlander would know at least that much about her own situation. Burned and vanished, died. No, she said, no. Her hands had started shaking and would not stop doing it. She only fell from a height of 2 meters. Nobody in the world dies from that. She must have hit her head. But when she fell, it had not even hurt her. Leandros was already halfway out of his chair behind her before she finished. Humans, said the prophet, can lose their lives even while they are sleeping. He turned his cup slowly on its saucer and did not soften 1 word of it. Her soul, having lost its own flesh, had wandered into an empty shell somebody left behind. She should not feel bad about it. If she kept living, she might find new value here. She did not believe him, she said, because that woman was her real sister. The tea table jumped when she stood up out of her chair. That was impossible. That was completely and absolutely impossible. A figure on a concrete stairwell under a streetlight, in a world made of glass and neon. Sister, she said out loud, to a room standing in another world entirely. A woman at the top of those stairs looking down at her without moving at all. And smiling. That was the part she had never allowed herself to remember properly. Back then, she remembered now. Back then, her sister had been smiling at her. Mireille! Gideon shouted and came straight up out of his chair. Leandros caught her before she reached the carpet and went down with her. Call a doctor, he said to the whole room at once, right now. Somebody tell me this is a dream, he thought, holding on to her on the floor. Sister, he said into her hair, and nobody in that room answered him at all. They put her to bed, and 3 men stood around it, and none of them spoke. Leandros turned the red stone at his collar over and over between 2 fingers. When he had looked at her lying there, the first feeling that came up in him was relief that she would stay here, or grief for the woman who died over there. He had not been able to decide which of the 2 it was, and he hated himself for both. You're awake, he said when her eyes opened. I was worried about you. She sat up, holding a cup she did not remember anybody putting into her hands. He watched her drink it and did not ask her a single question about any of it. Something small and very sharp went through the middle of her chest. The pain of it arrived a moment after she had already noticed it was there. She put a hand up against her own throat and held it there. It had not been a dream after all. Every part of it had been completely real. Dust turned slowly in the light of a room that belonged to somebody else entirely. "Mireille," he said, "please stop." She had been laughing, and it had not sounded like laughing for some time now. She sat with her head down and his hand around hers and finally went quiet. She wondered what had happened to her mother and her father after all of it. If she had known, she would have gone to see them, even just at the weekends. They probably knew who killed her. They must be completely destroyed by all of it. The sun went down over a balcony in a world that was made out of words. "I died," she said, to a room full of people who could not answer that. And then she sat there for a very long time and did not say anything else. Leandro stayed exactly where he was and never once let go of her hand. He had absolutely no idea what he was supposed to say to her about any of it. Gideon stood by the door and let the silence do whatever it needed to do. And the prophet sat in the corner with his staff across his knees, watching all of them. He had told her the truth because nobody else in that house was ever going to. And then, some hours later, he smiled at something only he could actually see. "Sister?" Leandro said, and came up out of his chair fast. She was standing in the middle of the room with both hands over her face. And then she wiped it off, straightened her apron, and reached for the door handle. If she moved that suddenly, she would collapse. She really should rest a little longer. "No," she said, "I'm fine." Where on earth did she think she was going in that condition? He caught her wrist in the doorway with the evening light coming in behind her. Today was the day she was supposed to receive the new ledgers from Lillian. "But," he said. "I said that I am fine," she told him and pulled her hand back. Until now, she had been coasting along, believing she would eventually go home. That was over. She was going to have to support herself in this world from now on. And she got into this house on a letter of recommendation, so he could not dismiss her. The door came open onto a corridor absolutely full of gold evening light. Outside, the sky over the estate had gone orange and violet all the way down. In the garden below, Lillian was already at the table with the ledgers and the delivery boy. Mars looked up first and started waving at her with both of his arms. "Miss Reeve," they called, and she ran the entire length of that path to them. The muggy summer air went past her cheeks the way it had in another country once. And the voice calling her name reached her loud and completely, perfectly clear. There was no need to run. What if she hurt herself? There are no retakes in this world. Therefore, she thought and took hold of the ledgers with both hands. She apologized properly for keeping the two of them waiting and bowed. And then she straightened up and smiled properly for the first time in days. She was quite sure that she would be able to do well here too, given time, just as she had in her own world. So who exactly is Takahashi Mireille now?